Giant Kodiak bear destroys SUV, kills tourist. August 9th, 2024. David Michael Ramirez had always been meticulous about planning his adventures. The 34-year-old software engineer from Portland, Oregon, spent months researching every detail of his solo trip to Alaska's Kodiak Island. His notebooks contained hand-drawn maps, weather patterns, wildlife migration schedules, and detailed itineraries written in his precise, engineering-trained handwriting. Friends often joked that David could plan a grocery store trip like a military operation. But this thoroughness had served him well throughout his career at Intel and during his numerous hiking expeditions across the Pacific Northwest. The morning of August 7th, 2024, found David standing in the rental car lot at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, keys to a silver Ford Explorer clutched in his weathered hands. The vehicle was exactly what he had requested, a 2023 model with all-wheel drive, reinforced undercarriage, and emergency communication equipment. Rental agent Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old Alaska native with 15 years of experience helping tourists navigate the last frontier, had personally inspected the vehicle twice before handing over the keys. "Mr. Ramirez," Sarah had said, her voice carrying the subtle accent of someone raised in Anchorage's Filipino community. "I need to stress again that Kodiak Island isn't like driving around downtown Portland. The roads can be treacherous even in good weather, and you're going during peak bear season. These animals aren't just large, they're the largest land predators in North America. A mature male Kodiak can weigh up to 1,500 pounds. David had nodded politely, his dark brown eyes reflecting the confidence of someone who had survived whiteout conditions on Mount Hood and navigated unmarked trails through Olympic National Forest. He stood 6 feet tall, with the lean build of a dedicated runner, his graying temples giving him a distinguished appearance that had helped him climb the corporate ladder at 3 different tech companies. His olive complexion spoke to his Mexican-American heritage, though he had been born and raised in Oregon after his grandparents immigrated from Guadalajara in the 1960s. "I appreciate the concern," David had replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But I've done extensive research. I have bear spray, a satellite communication device, and I'm planning to stick to the main roads and established camping areas. This isn't my first wilderness adventure." Sarah had glanced at David's file, noting his clean driving record and the premium insurance package he had purchased. Still, something about his casual confidence made her uneasy. She had grown up hearing stories from her uncle Roberto, who worked as a wildlife biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Uncle Roberto had seen what Kodiak bears could do to vehicles, cabins, and human beings. The stories weren't the kind you shared with tourists looking for adventure. The flight from Anchorage to Kodiak Island took 90 minutes, with David pressed against the window of the small Cessna 208, watching the landscape transform from urban sprawl to endless wilderness. Pilot James "Jimmy" Thompson, a 62-year-old bush pilot with 40 years of flying experience in Alaska, pointed out landmarks as they approached Kodiak Island. Jimmy's weathered face bore the scars of decades spent in Alaska's unforgiving environment. A jagged scar along his left cheek from a crash landing in 1987, crow's feet etched deep by years of squinting into Arctic wind, and hands that bore the permanent stains of aircraft fuel and engine oil. "See that inlet down there?" Jimmy called over the engine noise, pointing toward a pristine bay surrounded by dense forest. "That's where we filmed part of Alaska's Deadliest last year. Had a 1,200-pound boar come right up to the camera crew. Magnificent animal, but you don't want to meet one unexpectedly." David peered through the small aircraft window, his photographer's eye immediately drawn to the dramatic landscape below. The island stretched for miles in every direction, covered in a thick carpet of Sitka spruce and hemlock trees. Streams carved silver ribbons through the green expanse, and he could see the occasional flash of movement that might have been wildlife. His excitement built as he imagined the photographs he would capture during his 5-day stay. Landing at Kodiak Airport, David immediately noticed the difference in atmosphere compared to Anchorage. The terminal was smaller, more utilitarian, with worn linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that buzzed intermittently. Local residents moved with the unhurried pace of people accustomed to island life, while the few tourists present seemed almost hyper-aware of their surroundings, as if sensing they had entered truly wild territory. Airport manager Patricia "Patty" Kowalski, a 51-year-old transplant from Michigan who had moved to Alaska in 1995 after her divorce, greeted each incoming passenger with a mixture of hospitality and subtle warning. Patty had learned to read tourists quickly, identifying those who understood the risks they were undertaking versus those who saw Alaska as an exotic backdrop for their social media adventures. Something about David's demeanor suggested he fell somewhere in between these categories. "First time to Kodiak?" Patty asked as David collected his rental paperwork. "Yes, though I've spent considerable time in wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest," David replied. "I'm particularly interested in photographing the island's wildlife and documenting the intersection of tourism and conservation." Patty nodded, noting the expensive camera equipment David carried and his well-worn hiking boots. "The bears are especially active this time of year. Salmon Run is at its peak, which means they're feeding heavily before winter. They're also more territorial and aggressive. I'd strongly recommend staying near the lodge areas and avoiding any solo hiking." David thanked her for the advice, though inwardly he bristled slightly at what felt like condescension. He had successfully completed solo expeditions in some of America's most challenging wilderness areas. His Instagram account, at wildernesswanderer_PDX, had over 15,000 followers who regularly praised his stunning photography and detailed trip reports. He had summited Mount Rainier twice, survived a 3-day storm in the Cascade Mountains, and once tracked and photographed a family of black bears in Olympic National Forest without incident. The drive from Kodiak Airport to his accommodation at Emerald Bay Lodge took 45 minutes along winding coastal roads that offered breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean. David found himself stopping every few miles to capture photographs of the dramatic landscape. Towering cliffs dropping directly into pristine blue water, dense forests that seemed to stretch infinitely inland, and an enormous sky that dwarfed everything beneath it. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a bald eagle or the distant sound of waves crashing against rocks. Emerald Bay Lodge sat on a bluff overlooking a protected cove, its rustic cedar construction designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment. Owner Margaret "Maggie" Chen had purchased the property in 2018 after retiring from a successful career as a trauma surgeon in Seattle. At 57, Maggie maintained the lean strength of someone who spent her days hiking, fishing, and maintaining a remote lodge largely through her own efforts. Her black hair, streaked with premature silver, was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who built and repaired everything herself. "Welcome to Kodiak," Maggie said, as David pulled into the gravel parking area. "I'm Maggie Chen, and I'll be your host for the next few days. I hope you're ready for some spectacular wilderness." David climbed out of the Explorer, immediately struck by the crisp, clean air that carried scents of saltwater, pine trees, and something wild he couldn't identify. "This is incredible," he said, gesturing toward the panoramic view. "I can see why you chose this location." Maggie smiled, though David noticed her eyes were constantly scanning the tree line. "It's paradise, but it's also genuinely wild country. We have a healthy population of Kodiak bears, which is wonderful for the ecosystem, but requires constant awareness. I assume the rental agency briefed you on bear safety?" "Extensively," David replied. "I've also done my own research." I understand these bears are substantially larger than the black bears I'm familiar with back home. Larger, more aggressive, and infinitely more dangerous, Maggie confirmed. A mature male Kodiak bear can stand 11 feet tall on its hind legs and run 35 miles per hour. They're omnivores, but during salmon season they become particularly territorial about food sources. We've had several incidents over the years where bears have damaged vehicles or broken into cabins looking for food. David nodded, though privately he wondered if locals didn't exaggerate the danger somewhat to add drama to the tourist experience. He had encountered black bears multiple times during his Pacific Northwest adventures, and while he respected their power, he had never felt genuinely threatened. His bear spray had always been sufficient deterrent, and his knowledge of bear behavior had helped him avoid problematic encounters. Maggie showed him to his cabin, a well-appointed structure with a stone fireplace, kitchenette, and large windows facing the bay. The decor featured local artwork, handmade furniture, and numerous books about Alaska's natural history. David immediately noticed the heavy wooden shutters on each window and the reinforced door with multiple locking mechanisms. "Bit of overkill for the security, isn't it?" David asked with a slight smile. Maggie's expression remained serious. 2 years ago, a bear broke through the window of cabin 4 while guests were sleeping. Fortunately, they were able to lock themselves in the bathroom and radio for help. We've had to significantly upgrade our construction standards. That evening, David joined Maggie and the lodge's other guests for dinner around a communal fire pit. The group included Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist from UC San Diego, studying the impact of climate change on Alaska's coastal ecosystems, Marcus and Jennifer Wong, a retired couple from Vancouver celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary, and Tyler Brooks, a 26-year-old wildlife photographer from National Geographic on assignment to document Kodiak Island's ecosystem. Tyler, a tall, lean man with prematurely receding hair, and the intense focus of someone perpetually looking for the perfect shot, immediately connected with David over their shared passion for wilderness photography. "I've been coming to Alaska for 5 years, Tyler said, showing David images on his camera's LCD screen, "and Kodiak consistently offers the most dramatic wildlife encounters. Last month, I photographed a sow with 3 cubs fishing for salmon just 2 miles from here." Dr. Vasquez, a petite woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked up from the scientific journal she was reading. "Were you able to maintain proper distance?" Cubs make mothers extremely aggressive. A sow protecting young cubs has been known to charge vehicles, helicopters, and even small aircraft. "I used a 600mm lens from approximately 200 yards, Tyler replied, "though I'll admit she was aware of my presence and clearly agitated. I didn't stay long." Marcus Wong, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of a retired high school principal, leaned forward. "We saw something interesting on our hike yesterday. Jennifer and I were walking the Emerald Lake Trail when we found several trees with claw marks 8 feet off the ground. The bark was completely stripped away." Jennifer Wong, a small woman with silver hair and the quick movements of someone who had spent decades keeping up with teenagers, added, "The marks looked fresh. Whatever made them was enormous." Maggie nodded grimly. "We've been tracking a particularly large male through the area for the past 3 weeks. Fish and Game estimates he weighs close to 1,500 pounds. He's been following the salmon runs, but his territory is expanding as the season progresses. We've advised all guests to stay within a half-mile of the lodge." David felt a thrill of excitement rather than concern. A bear of that size would make for incredible photographs, assuming he could maintain safe distance and proper positioning. His mind immediately began calculating focal lengths, shutter speeds, and approach strategies. "Has anyone been able to photograph this bear?" Tyler shook his head. I've been trying for 2 weeks. He's extremely elusive and seems to avoid areas with human scent. The few glimpses I've caught have been at extreme distance, and the light wasn't right for quality images. That night, David lay in his comfortable bed listening to the sounds of the Alaskan wilderness. Waves crashed rhythmically against the rocky shore below, while an owl called somewhere in the dense forest behind the lodge. Occasionally, he heard what might have been large animals moving through the underbrush, but the sounds were too distant and indistinct to identify with certainty. August 8th dawned clear and warm, with temperatures reaching an unusually comfortable 72 degrees. David woke early, eager to begin exploring the island's photography opportunities. Over breakfast, Maggie provided him with detailed maps showing established trails, emergency shelter locations, and areas to avoid due to recent bear activity. "I'd strongly recommend staying on the marked trails today," Maggie said, pointing to several red X's marked on the map. "These areas have shown fresh bear signs within the past 48 hours. Fish and Game flew over yesterday and spotted the large male we discussed last night near Horseshoe Creek." David studied the map carefully, noting that Horseshoe Creek was approximately 12 miles from the lodge, via a combination of paved road and established dirt track. The area featured a series of waterfalls, where salmon would naturally congregate during their upstream migration, exactly the type of location where spectacular wildlife photography opportunities would present themselves. "What about this route along the coastal road?" David asked, tracing his finger along a line that led past several marked scenic overlooks. "It looks like it provides access to multiple ecosystems without requiring extensive hiking." Maggie nodded approvingly. "That's an excellent choice for your first day. The road is well maintained, you'll have cell coverage for most of the route, and there are several pull-offs with spectacular views. You should see plenty of wildlife while maintaining safe distances." David loaded his photography equipment into the Explorer, double-checking each item against his carefully prepared list. 2 camera bodies, 5 different lenses ranging from wide-angle to extreme telephoto, extra batteries, memory cards, tripod, and various filters and accessories. His backpack contained emergency supplies including first aid kit, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, high-energy food, and his satellite communication device. The bear spray was clipped to his belt in an easily accessible position. The coastal road exceeded David's expectations, winding along dramatic cliffs with the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. He stopped frequently to photograph sea otters playing in kelp forests, bald eagles soaring overhead, and the interplay of light and shadow across the island's diverse landscape. His excitement grew with each successful image, and he found himself pushing slightly further from the marked pull-offs to capture unique angles and compositions. Around midday, David encountered Tyler Brooks photographing a family of Stella's sea lions from a rocky outcrop. Tyler waved enthusiastically and jogged over to compare notes about the morning's photography. "Any luck with terrestrial wildlife?" David asked, scrolling through Tyler's images on his camera's LCD screen. "I spotted what looked like bear tracks near the Salmon Falls overlook, but no actual sightings," Tyler replied. "The tracks were massive. Definitely from the big male Fish and Game has been monitoring. I'm thinking about setting up a blind there tomorrow morning." David felt his pulse quicken. "Would you mind showing me the location?" "I'd be interested in documenting the tracks, even if I don't encounter the bear itself." Tyler hesitated. "It's about 6 miles off the main road, down a pretty rough track. Maggie specifically warned against going into that area alone." "I understand the risks," David replied, "but I'm experienced with wildlife photography, and I have all the necessary safety equipment. Besides, documenting the tracks themselves would be valuable for understanding bear movement patterns in the area." After some discussion, Tyler agreed to provide GPS coordinates and detailed directions to the location where he had observed the tracks. "Promise me you'll stay in your vehicle and won't attempt to track the animal on foot," Tyler said. "These Kodiak bears aren't like the black bears you're used to in Oregon. They're apex predators with no natural fear of humans." David promised to exercise appropriate caution, though inwardly he bristled at what felt like condescension. He had successfully photographed black bears, cougars, and elk in challenging wilderness conditions throughout the Pacific Northwest. While he respected the additional size and power of Kodiak bears, he felt confident in his ability to assess and manage risk appropriately. That evening, David reviewed his photographs from the day while enjoying a salmon dinner at the lodge. His images were spectacular, dramatic landscapes, compelling wildlife portraits, and several shots that would definitely earn featured placement on his Instagram account. The positive feedback from his online followers was already pouring in as he posted a few preview images with captions about Alaska's incredible wilderness. Dr. Vasquez joined him at his table, curious about his photography techniques and equipment. "Your telephoto lens is impressive," she said, examining his 600mm lens. "What kind of working distance does that provide for photographing large wildlife?" "At maximum focal length, I can capture frame-filling images of a bear from approximately 200 yards, David explained. "That's well beyond what wildlife biologists consider the minimum safe distance for bear encounters." "In theory, yes, Doctor," Vasquez replied, "but Kodiak bears are unpredictable, especially during salmon season when they're hyper-focused on feeding. A bear that seems calm and disinterested can cover 200 yards in less than 20 seconds if something triggers its defensive instincts." David nodded politely, though he found the constant warnings somewhat exhausting. He understood that locals wanted to emphasize safety, but he also felt that excessive caution might prevent him from capturing the truly extraordinary images that had drawn him to Alaska in the first place. August 9th began with unusual weather conditions that immediately caught David's attention as he prepared for his planned photography expedition. The morning was eerily calm, with no wind stirring the trees around Emerald Bay Lodge, and a strange, oppressive quality to the air that seemed to muffle normal sounds. The temperature had risen overnight to an unseasonably warm 78 degrees, and the humidity was higher than typical for the region. Meteorologist Sandra Kim at the National Weather Service office in Anchorage would later note in her incident report that a high-pressure system had stalled over the Gulf of Alaska, creating unusual atmospheric conditions that affected wildlife behavior patterns throughout the region. The combination of high temperature, elevated humidity, and barometric pressure changes often correlates with increased agitation in large mammals. Dr. Kim would write, "Bears in particular become more unpredictable when normal weather patterns are disrupted." David loaded his equipment into the Ford Explorer at 6:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on the first photograph he took that morning, a dramatic sunrise image over Emerald Bay that would later be used by news organizations reporting on the incident. He had decided to pursue the location Tyler Brooks had described, where fresh bear tracks had been observed near Salmon Falls. The 6-mile drive down increasingly rough terrain would challenge the explorer's capabilities, but David felt confident in both the vehicle and his own driving skills. Maggie Chen intercepted him as he prepared to leave, her expression showing more concern than usual. "David, I've been monitoring weather reports, and conditions are unusual today. Fish and Game issued an advisory yesterday afternoon about increased bear activity throughout the island. I'd really prefer if you stayed closer to the lodge." David appreciated her concern, but felt frustrated by what seemed like excessive caution. "I understand your concerns, Maggie, but I'm an experienced wilderness photographer with proper safety equipment. I'm planning to stay with my vehicle and maintain safe distances from any wildlife I encounter." Maggie's expression remained troubled. It's not just about distance, David. Something feels different today. The forest has been unusually quiet this morning, and my dog has been agitated since before dawn. Local wildlife often senses changes that humans miss. David looked toward the forest surrounding the lodge, noting that it did seem quieter than previous mornings. However, he attributed this to normal variation in animal behavior rather than any specific cause for concern. His excitement about potentially documenting the massive male bear that had been sighted in the area overshadowed his willingness to modify his plans based on vague feelings of unease. "I have my satellite communicator, bear spray, and emergency supplies," David replied. "I'll check in every 2 hours and return immediately if conditions seem problematic." At 7:23 a.m., David began driving toward the GPS coordinates Tyler had provided, following the coastal road for approximately 8 miles, before turning onto a progressively narrower dirt track that wound inland through increasingly dense forest. The Explorer handled the rough terrain well, though David found himself driving more slowly than anticipated as the track became rockier and more challenging to navigate. The forest closed in around the narrow road, creating a tunnel effect with towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock blocking most of the sky. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dramatic lighting conditions that David noted would be perfect for photography. The air inside the vehicle grew warmer as he lost the cooling effect of the coastal breeze, and he rolled down the windows to enjoy the forest sounds and scents. At 8:15 a.m., according to the GPS log that would later be recovered from David's satellite communicator, he reached a small clearing where the track widened slightly and provided space to turn around. This location offered his first clear view of Salmon Falls, a series of cascading waterfalls where Pacific salmon were actively jumping upstream in their annual migration. The sight was spectacular. Dozens of large fish launching themselves through the air in their desperate attempt to reach spawning grounds, while the sound of rushing water echoed through the forest. David parked the Explorer at the edge of the clearing, positioning it for a quick departure while providing optimal camera angles toward the falls. He spent several minutes studying the area through binoculars, looking for signs of bear activity, while also assessing the best positions for photography. The tracks Tyler had described were clearly visible in the soft earth near the water's edge. Massive paw prints, nearly 12 inches long, with distinctive claw marks extending several inches beyond the pad impressions. The tracks appeared fresh, possibly made within the past 24 hours based on their sharp edges, and the fact that no rain had fallen to blur their definition. David felt his excitement building as he realized he was definitely in the territory of the massive male bear that had been sighted throughout the area. Even if he didn't encounter the animal directly, documenting these tracks and the salmon run would provide compelling images for his portfolio. At 8:42 a.m., David began photographing from inside the Explorer with his windows down, using his longest telephoto lens to capture detailed images of the salmon run and the surrounding forest. The lighting was perfect. Warm, golden sunlight filtering through the canopy and illuminating the spray from the waterfalls. His images were spectacular, and he found himself completely absorbed in the creative process of composing shots and adjusting camera settings for optimal results. The first indication that something had changed in the forest around him was so subtle that David initially dismissed it as imagination. The constant background chorus of birds and small animals that had accompanied him throughout the morning gradually faded to complete silence. Even the buzzing of insects seemed to stop, leaving only the sound of rushing water from the falls. David noticed this change at approximately 9:18 a.m., but attributed it to normal variation in animal behavior. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had studied predator-prey relationships in various ecosystems, would later explain to investigators that the sudden silence of small wildlife often indicates the presence of a major predator. "Forest animals have evolved sophisticated warning systems," she explained. "When birds, squirrels, and other small creatures suddenly fall silent, it usually means an apex predator has entered the area. This behavior can serve as an early warning system for humans, but only if they understand what the silence indicates." At 9:31 a.m., David captured what would become one of the most widely circulated wildlife photographs of 2024, a dramatic image of a massive salmon launching itself through a shaft of sunlight as it attempted to clear the falls. The composition was perfect, the lighting spectacular, and the technical execution flawless. David reviewed the image on his camera's LCD screen with satisfaction, knowing he had captured something truly special. It was while reviewing this photograph that David first became aware he was no longer alone in the clearing. The sensation was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the warm temperature. He looked up from his camera and began scanning the forest around the clearing, using his binoculars to examine areas where the shadows were deepest. Initially, David saw nothing unusual. The forest appeared empty and peaceful, with shafts of sunlight creating a cathedral-like atmosphere among the towering trees. However, as his eyes adjusted to the varying light conditions, he began to notice subtle signs that something large had recently moved through the area. Broken branches at a height that would indicate a very large animal, disturbed undergrowth, and what appeared to be scratch marks on several tree trunks. At 9:44 a.m., David spotted movement in his peripheral vision and turned to see what would later be identified as the largest Kodiak bear ever documented on the island. The massive male emerged from the forest approximately 150 yards from David's position, moving with the deceptively casual gait that characterized bears when they were not actively hunting or threatened. Even at distance, the animal's enormous size was immediately apparent. Wildlife biologist Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to Maggie Chen, would later estimate the bear's weight at approximately 1,480 pounds based on photographic analysis and paw print measurements recovered from the scene. This was an exceptionally large specimen, likely in the top 1% of recorded Kodiak bear sizes, Dr. Chen reported. An animal of this size would stand approximately 11 feet tall on its hind legs and possess the strength to overturn vehicles weighing several tons. David's first reaction was excitement rather than fear. This was exactly the wildlife encounter he had traveled to Alaska hoping to experience, and the bear's initial behavior suggested calm rather than aggression. The massive animal was focused on the salmon run, moving toward the water's edge with the single-minded purpose of a predator approaching a rich feeding ground. David immediately began photographing, using his longest telephoto lens to capture images while maintaining what he believed was a safe distance. The bear's coat was a rich, dark brown with silver-tipped fur that caught the morning sunlight beautifully. Its massive head was perfectly proportioned to its enormous body, with small ears that seemed almost comically tiny compared to the animal's overall size. Most striking were its eyes, dark, intelligent, and constantly scanning the environment for potential threats or opportunities. For approximately 12 minutes, David documented the bear's behavior as it waded into the shallow water at the base of the falls and began fishing for salmon. The animal's fishing technique was impressive, waiting patiently for salmon to jump within range, then striking with lightning-fast paw movements that seemed impossible for something so large. David captured several spectacular images of the bear catching fish, including one shot where a salmon was frozen in mid-air just inches from the bear's open mouth. Throughout this initial period, the bear seemed largely unaware of David's presence or chose to ignore the human observer. This behavior was consistent with David's previous experiences photographing black bears, which had generally shown little interest in humans who maintained respectful distances and avoided direct confrontation. At 10:03 a.m., something changed in the bear's behavior that would later be identified as the critical turning point in the encounter. The massive animal suddenly stopped fishing and lifted its head, turning to look directly toward David's position. The bear's posture shifted from the relaxed stance of a feeding animal to the alert, tense positioning of a predator assessing a potential threat. Dr. Marcus Webb, a wildlife behaviorist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who reviewed security footage and witness statements from the incident, identified several factors that likely contributed to the bear's changing behavior. The wind direction had shifted, carrying human scent directly toward the bear's position. Additionally, the sound of the camera's motor drive, while quiet to human ears, would have been clearly audible to an animal with the acute hearing of a Kodiak bear. Most significantly, the bear had been feeding successfully and may have begun to view the human presence as a potential threat to its food source. David noticed the bear's attention, but initially felt no particular concern. In his experience with black bears, direct eye contact was often followed by the animal withdrawing from the area. He continued photographing while remaining inside the Explorer, believing that the vehicle provided adequate protection and that the bear would eventually lose interest and move away. Instead, the bear began moving toward David's position. The movement was not the charging rush of an animal in full attack mode, but rather the deliberate, purposeful advance of a predator investigating something that had attracted its attention. The massive animal moved with surprising grace for something weighing nearly 3/4 of a ton, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick coat as it covered ground with deceptively long strides. At 10:07 a.m., when the bear had closed the distance to approximately 75 yards, David began to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern. This was closer than any bear had ever approached him during his previous wildlife photography experiences, and the animal's size made the situation qualitatively different from anything he had encountered before. He started the Explorer's engine, preparing to withdraw from the area if the bear continued its approach. The sound of the engine starting seemed to galvanize the bear's attention rather than deterring it. The massive animal stopped approximately 50 yards from the vehicle and reared up on its hind legs, reaching its full height of nearly 11 feet. From this position, the bear had a clear view over the Explorer's roof and could assess both the vehicle and its human occupant with devastating clarity. David later told investigators that seeing the bear at full height was when he first truly comprehended the magnitude of the animal he was dealing with. It was like looking at a biological impossibility, he would say from his hospital bed 3 weeks later. Nothing that large should be able to move with such grace and speed. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. For approximately 30 seconds, human and bear stared at each other across the clearing. David had stopped photographing, his complete attention focused on assessing the situation and planning his response if the bear continued its approach. The animal's eyes seemed to bore into him with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. This was not the simple curiosity or mild interest he had experienced with smaller bears, but rather the focused attention of an apex predator making decisions about a potential threat. At 10:08 a.m., the bear dropped back to all fours and resumed its approach toward the Explorer. David immediately put the vehicle in reverse, beginning to back away while keeping the bear in sight. His plan was to withdraw slowly and calmly, avoiding any sudden movements that might trigger the animal's chase response while maintaining enough distance to ensure his safety. The bear's response to the retreating vehicle was immediate and alarming. Instead of losing interest as David had expected, the massive animal shifted into a faster gait that covered ground with shocking efficiency. The bear was not yet running at full speed, but its purposeful advance was closing the distance faster than David could safely reverse through the forest clearing. David shifted the Explorer into drive and began moving forward along the narrow track that led back toward the main road. His intention was to leave the area quickly but safely, avoiding the panicked flight that might trigger the bear's prey drive while putting distance between himself and the enormous predator. He maintained visual contact with the bear through his mirrors while navigating the increasingly narrow and winding track. For the first quarter mile, this strategy appeared successful. The bear followed the retreating vehicle but did not increase its pace beyond a determined walk. David began to feel that he was managing the situation appropriately, withdrawing from the bear's territory while avoiding confrontation. His heart rate was elevated, but his thinking remained clear, and he focused on driving safely through terrain that required careful navigation. At 10:14 a.m., approximately half a mile from the Salmon Falls, David encountered the fallen tree that would later be identified as the decisive factor in the incident's tragic outcome. A massive Sitka spruce, undermined by recent heavy rains and high winds, had fallen across the narrow track during the previous night. The tree's trunk was approximately 4 feet in diameter, far too large to drive over, and its position completely blocked the track, with no room for the Explorer to maneuver around the obstruction. David stopped the vehicle approximately 20 feet from the fallen tree, his mind racing as he assessed his options. He could attempt to clear a path around the obstruction, but this would require leaving the vehicle and working in close proximity to a massive bear that was still approaching his position. He could try to reverse back toward the Salmon Falls, but this would mean driving directly toward the bear while navigating a narrow, winding track that would severely limit his speed and maneuverability. The third option was to use his satellite communicator to call for emergency assistance, but David realized that help would be hours away, even under the best circumstances. Kodiak Island's remote location and challenging terrain meant that rescue operations required significant time to organize and deploy, regardless of the urgency of the situation. While David was considering his options, the bear had continued its steady approach and was now visible through the Explorer's rear window at a distance of approximately 100 yards. The massive animal showed no signs of losing interest or abandoning its pursuit. If anything, the stopped vehicle seemed to have attracted even more attention as the bear began moving with increased purpose toward the now stationary target. At 10:16 a.m., David made the decision to attempt backing away from the fallen tree while looking for a wider section of the track where he might be able to turn around. This strategy required driving in reverse while constantly monitoring the bear's position and navigating terrain that was challenging even when driving forward. The stress of the situation was beginning to affect his decision-making, though he remained focused on finding a solution that would allow him to escape without direct confrontation. The Explorer's backup camera provided a clear view of the track behind the vehicle, but David found himself constantly checking his mirrors and turning to look through the rear window to monitor the bear's position. The massive animal was now close enough that its individual features were clearly visible. The intelligent eyes, the slight scarring around the muzzle that indicated an experienced animal, and most intimidatingly, the enormous claws that extended several inches from each massive paw. As David backed slowly along the track, searching for a place to turn around, the bear's behavior evolved in ways that would later be analyzed extensively by wildlife behaviorists and incident investigators. Rather than simply following the retreating vehicle, the massive animal began displaying what experts would identify as territorial and predatory behaviors, specifically directed toward the Explorer and its human occupant. At 10:19 a.m., the bear began periodically rising to its hind legs while continuing to follow the retreating vehicle, each time reaching its full 11-foot height to maintain visual contact over the explorer's roof. This behavior indicated that the animal was actively tracking the vehicle's movements rather than simply investigating out of curiosity. More ominously, the bear began making vocalizations, deep, rumbling sounds that carried clearly through the forest and seemed to resonate in David's chest even from inside the vehicle. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a Kodiak bear specialist who reviewed audio recordings recovered from David's camera equipment, identified these vocalizations as territorial warnings combined with predatory assessment calls. The bear was essentially announcing its dominance of the territory, while simultaneously evaluating the vehicle and its occupant as potential prey or threat, Dr. Mitchell explained. This combination of behaviors is extremely rare and typically occurs only when a bear views a human presence as both a territorial challenge and a potential feeding opportunity. David had managed to back approximately 300 yards along the winding track when he encountered the second major obstruction that would seal his fate. A washout from recent heavy rains had carved a deep gully across the track, creating a depression approximately 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The explorer could not safely cross this obstacle in reverse, and the terrain on either side was too steep and unstable to provide an alternative route. Trapped between the fallen tree ahead and the washout behind, with a massive and increasingly aggressive bear approaching his position, David found himself in a situation that offered no clear escape route. His satellite communicator showed full signal strength, and he activated the emergency beacon, while simultaneously calling the Alaska State Troopers Emergency Dispatch Center. The emergency call was received at 10:23 a.m. by dispatcher Linda Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran of Alaska's emergency services with extensive experience handling wilderness emergencies. Linda immediately recognized the severity of the situation based on David's voice, stressed but still coherent, and the GPS coordinates that placed him in one of Kodiak Island's most remote areas. Alaska State Troopers, this is Linda. I'm showing your GPS location and emergency beacon activation. What's your situation? David's voice was tight with stress but remained clear. I'm trapped on a forestry track about 6 miles northeast of Salmon Falls with a massive bear approaching my vehicle. I have obstacles blocking my path, both forward and backward. The bear has been following me for about 15 minutes and is getting closer. Linda immediately began coordinating a multi-agency response while keeping David on the line. Sir, I'm dispatching a helicopter crew and fish and game officers to your location. Can you stay inside your vehicle? Do you have bear spray or other defensive tools? I have bear spray and I'm staying in my vehicle, David replied. The bear is about 50 yards away now and still approaching. It's enormous. I'd estimate at least 1,200 pounds. Linda had handled dozens of bear encounters during her career, but something about David's situation raised immediate red flags. Most bear encounters ended with the animal losing interest and withdrawing, especially when humans remained inside vehicles. A bear that continued approaching a vehicle over an extended period was displaying abnormal behavior that suggested either territorial aggression or predatory interest. David, I need you to stay calm and keep your vehicle between you and the bear, Linda instructed. Our helicopter crew is launching now, but they need approximately 45 minutes to reach your location. Do not leave your vehicle under any circumstances. At 10:26 a.m., while David was still on the phone with emergency dispatch, the bear closed the distance to approximately 30 yards from the Explorer's rear bumper. At this range, the animal's massive size was overwhelming, even from inside the vehicle. David estimated the bear's shoulder height at nearly 5 feet while walking on all fours, with a bulk that seemed to fill his entire field of vision through the rear window. More alarming than the bear's size was its behavior, which had shifted from curious investigation to what wildlife experts would later identify as active stalking. The massive animal was moving with the focused intensity of a predator that had identified prey, its eyes locked on the vehicle, while its body language displayed the coiled tension of an animal preparing for action. "Linda, the bear is getting very close," David reported, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "It's looking directly at me and making some kind of growling sound. This doesn't feel like normal bear behavior." Linda had contacted wildlife trooper Jake Morrison, who was approximately 20 minutes away by boat from David's general area. Jake had 15 years of experience with Kodiak bear incidents and was immediately concerned by the description of the bear's behavior. "Put me on speaker with the caller," Jake instructed Linda. "David, this is wildlife trooper Morrison. I need you to describe exactly what the bear is doing right now." David tilted his phone toward the rear window so Jake could hear the bear's vocalizations, which had grown louder and more frequent. The deep, rumbling sounds were unlike anything David had heard from the black bears he had previously encountered, carrying an ominous quality that seemed to vibrate through the explorer's frame. "Jesus," Jake muttered, immediately recognizing the sounds. "Linda, upgrade this to Code Red and get Fish and Game's helicopter team airborne immediately. This bear is displaying predatory behavior toward the vehicle. I've only seen this twice before, and both incidents ended badly." The Code Red designation triggered the highest level of emergency response available for wildlife incidents on Kodiak Island. Within minutes, multiple agencies were coordinating resources to reach David's location, including the Alaska State Troopers helicopter crew, fish and game officers, and emergency medical personnel. However, even under optimal conditions, the earliest any assistance could reach the remote location would be 35 to 40 minutes. At 10:31 a.m., the massive bear approached to within 15 yards of the explorer's rear bumper and stopped, rising to its full height on its hind legs. From this position, the animal towered over the vehicle, its massive head nearly 12 feet above the ground as it peered down at the human inside. The bear's posture was unmistakably aggressive, ears flattened against its skull, lips pulled back to display enormous canine teeth, and powerful forearms held ready for action. David found himself looking up at the bear through the explorer's rear window, fully comprehending for the first time the hopelessness of his situation. The vehicle that had seemed like adequate protection suddenly felt as fragile as an eggshell compared to the massive predator looming above it. The bear's intelligent eyes seemed to be calculating the best approach for dealing with what it had clearly identified as prey trapped inside a metal shell. "The bear is standing right behind my vehicle," David reported to Jake Morrison, his voice now showing clear signs of panic. "It's looking down at me and I think it's trying to figure out how to get to me. What should I do?" Jake's response was immediate and urgent. "Do not leave the vehicle under any circumstances. Do not honk the horn or make loud noises that might trigger an attack. Try to avoid direct eye contact if possible. The helicopter is en route, but you need to buy time." For approximately 2 minutes, the bear remained in its intimidating upright position behind the explorer, studying the vehicle and its occupant with the focused attention of a predator solving a puzzle. During this time, David captured several photographs that would later provide crucial evidence for the incident investigation. The images clearly showed the bear's massive size, aggressive posture, and the intelligent calculation in its eyes as it assessed the situation. At 10:33 a.m., the bear dropped back to all fours and began circling the explorer, a behavior that wildlife experts would later identify as classic predatory stalking. The massive animal moved around the vehicle in a wide circle, approaching from different angles while maintaining constant visual contact with David through the windows. This circling behavior indicated that the bear was no longer simply curious or territorially defensive, but was actively hunting the human inside the vehicle. "It's walking around my car," David reported, his voice tight with fear. "It keeps looking at me through the windows from different sides." I don't think it's going to give up and leave. Jake Morrison had reached the boat launch and was heading toward David's general area, but he was still at least 15 minutes away from the closest point where he could reach the forestry track on foot. The helicopter crew was approximately 25 minutes out, flying at maximum speed through weather conditions that were deteriorating as the morning progressed. As the bear completed its first circle around the Explorer, David noticed that the animal was paying particular attention to the vehicle's windows and doors, as if evaluating potential entry points. The bear's behavior was methodical and intelligent, displaying a problem-solving approach that was both fascinating and terrifying to observe. At 10:36 a.m., the bear approached the driver's side door and began sniffing around the window sill, its massive nostrils flaring as it processed the human scent concentrated in this area. David could see the animal's face in perfect detail through the side window, the small, intelligent eyes, the black nose that was larger than a human fist, and the slightly open mouth that revealed teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The bear's investigation of the driver's door was interrupted when it noticed David's movement inside the vehicle. The massive animal immediately focused its attention on the human, pressing its face close to the window glass and studying David with an intensity that was profoundly unsettling. For approximately 30 seconds, predator and prey examined each other through a barrier of glass that suddenly seemed impossibly thin and fragile. "Linda, patch me through to the helicopter crew," Jake Morrison radioed from his boat. "I need to coordinate our approach to avoid spooking this bear into an immediate attack." The helicopter pilot, Captain Sarah Martinez, had been flying Alaska rescue missions for 8 years and had responded to numerous wildlife incidents, but the urgency in Jake's voice indicated this situation was escalating beyond typical bear encounters. "Jake, this is Captain Martinez. We're 18 minutes out from the GPS coordinates. What's the tactical situation?" "We have a code-red predatory stalking situation with an estimated 1,500-pound male Kodiak bear," Jake replied. "The bear has been circling the victim's vehicle for several minutes and is displaying active hunting behavior. This is not a normal territorial defense. This animal views the human as prey." Captain Martinez immediately understood the implications. In her experience, bears that had progressed to active stalking behavior were extremely difficult to deter without lethal force, and approaching the scene by helicopter created additional risks of triggering an attack through noise and rotor wash disturbance. At 10:39 a.m., the massive bear completed its examination of the driver's side and moved to the front of the Explorer, where it began investigating the vehicle's grille and headlights. David watched in horrified fascination as the bear used its massive paws to test the vehicle's structural integrity, pressing against the hood and bumper with enough force to make the Explorer rock slightly on its suspension. The bear's investigation revealed what would later be identified as a critical vulnerability in the Explorer's construction. While the vehicle was robust by normal standards, it had not been designed to withstand the focused attention of a 1,500-pound predator with claws capable of tearing through sheet metal. The bear's experimental pushing and prodding began to identify weak points in the vehicle's structure that could potentially be exploited. "The bear is testing my car," David reported, his voice now clearly showing panic, despite his efforts to remain calm. "It's pushing on the front end, and the whole vehicle is moving. I don't think the car is strong enough to keep it out if it really wants to get to me." Jake Morrison was now approximately 8 minutes away from the closest approach point to David's location. But even at maximum speed through challenging forest terrain, he would still need at least 12 to 15 minutes to reach the scene on foot. The helicopter crew was making better time than originally estimated, but was still at least 12 minutes away from arriving overhead. "David, the bear is testing the vehicle's defenses," Jake explained. "This is normal behavior for a Kodiak bear encountering something new." Most of the time they lose interest when they realize they can't easily access whatever has attracted their attention, try to remain calm and avoid making sudden movements. However, Jake's reassuring words masked his growing concern about the situation's trajectory. In his 15 years of experience, he had never encountered a Kodiak bear that maintained focused predatory behavior toward a vehicle for such an extended period. Most bears either lost interest within the first few minutes or were deterred by the vehicle's size and unfamiliarity. This bear's persistent and methodical approach suggested an animal with previous experience around vehicles or humans, which significantly increased the danger level. At 10:42 a.m., the bear moved to the passenger side of the Explorer and began examining the windows and door handles with the same methodical attention it had shown to other parts of the vehicle. David noticed that the bear's investigation was becoming more focused and aggressive, with the massive animal using its claws to scratch at the window seals and door frames. The sound of the bear's claws scraping against metal and glass was amplified inside the vehicle's enclosed space, creating an unnerving soundtrack that made David's situation feel increasingly desperate. Each scratch and scrape served as a reminder of the enormous strength focused on finding a way through the Explorer's protective barriers. "I can hear it trying to get into the car," David reported, his voice now trembling with fear. "It's using its claws on the windows and doors." How long until help arrives? Linda Rodriguez had been coordinating the multi-agency response and had updates from all responding units. "David, the helicopter is about 10 minutes out, and Wildlife Trooper Morrison is approximately 6 minutes from reaching your area on foot. You're doing great. Just keep the vehicle between you and the bear." During this period, David made the decision to document the encounter through both photography and video recording, partly as a distraction from his fear, and partly because he realized he might be capturing the only detailed record of Kodiak bear predatory behavior toward vehicles. The images and video he captured during these crucial minutes would later provide invaluable scientific data about bear behavior under extreme circumstances. The photographs David took showed the bear's methodical examination of the Explorer from multiple angles, its intelligent problem-solving approach to accessing the vehicle's interior, and the massive size differential between predator and prey. Most striking were the images of the bear's face pressed against various windows, its dark eyes focused intently on David, with what could only be described as predatory calculation. At 10:45 a.m., the bear's behavior shifted in a way that would later be identified as the final escalation before the attack phase. The massive animal had completed its circumnavigation and assessment of the Explorer and had apparently reached conclusions about the vehicle's vulnerabilities. Instead of continuing its methodical investigation, the bear began displaying the agitated pacing and vocalizations that wildlife experts recognize as pre-attack behavior. The bear's movements became more rapid and less controlled, with the animal repeatedly approaching the vehicle from different angles while making increasingly loud and aggressive vocalizations. The deep, rumbling sounds had evolved into what could only be described as roars, powerful vocalizations that seemed to shake the forest around the clearing and vibrated through the Explorer's frame with alarming intensity. "The bear's behavior is changing," David reported, his voice now tight with genuine terror. "It's moving faster and making much louder sounds. It seems more agitated than before." Jake Morrison had reached the forest track approximately half a mile from David's position and was making his way through the dense undergrowth as quickly as the terrain would allow. He could hear the bear's vocalizations echoing through the forest, and his experienced ear immediately recognized the sounds as those made by an animal preparing for aggressive action. "David, I can hear the bear from my position," Jake radioed. "I need you to prepare your bear spray and have it ready to deploy if the bear manages to damage the vehicle. Do not spray unless you have a clear shot at the bear's face from close range. bear spray is only effective at very short distances. The helicopter crew was now approximately 7 minutes from arrival, but Captain Martinez was dealing with deteriorating weather conditions that were affecting visibility and creating dangerous wind conditions for low-altitude maneuvering. A weather front was moving through the area, bringing gusty winds and intermittent cloud cover that would complicate the rescue operation even once they reached the scene. At 10:47 a.m., the massive bear made its first direct attack on the Ford Explorer. The animal reared up on its hind legs and brought its full weight and strength to bear against the vehicle's passenger side, striking the door and window with both forepaws in a coordinated assault that demonstrated shocking power and precision. The impact was tremendous, causing the entire Explorer to rock violently and producing a sound like thunder echoing through the forest. David was thrown against the driver's side door by the force of the impact, his camera equipment scattering across the vehicle's interior, the passenger side window spider-webbed but held, while the door frame was visibly deformed by the massive blow. "It's attacking the car!" David screamed into his phone. "The whole car is shaking. The window is cracked." Jake Morrison was still approximately 6 minutes away from reaching David's position, pushing through the forest as rapidly as possible while carrying his rifle and emergency equipment. The sound of the bear's attack carried clearly through the forest, and Jake knew from experience that once a Kodiak bear committed to this level of aggression, the situation was likely to escalate rapidly until either the bear succeeded in its attack or was driven off by superior force. The helicopter crew could now hear the bear's vocalizations and the sounds of the attack through their radio communication with ground personnel. Captain Martinez pushed her aircraft to maximum safe speed while coordinating with her crew about the tactical approach they would need to use to intervene effectively without making the situation worse. Following its first successful strike against the Explorer, the bear immediately pressed its attack with a second assault against the same passenger door. This time, the massive animal used its claws as well as its raw strength, raking deep gouges in the metal while simultaneously attempting to force the door open through brute strength. The combination of claws and crushing weight proved devastatingly effective against the vehicle's civilian construction. The passenger door gave way under the second assault, the frame buckling and the latch mechanism failing as the bear's enormous strength overcame the Explorer's structural integrity. The door hung open at an odd angle, no longer providing any barrier between the massive predator and the vehicle's interior. David found himself looking directly at the bear through the destroyed doorway, with nothing but a few feet of space separating him from certain death. For a moment that seemed to last forever, predator and prey stared at each other across the violated threshold of the Explorer's interior. The bear's massive head filled the damaged doorway, its dark eyes locked onto David with the focused intensity of a successful hunter that had finally cornered its prey. David could see every detail of the animal's face. The slight scarring around the muzzle, the enormous canine teeth, and most terrifyingly, the intelligence and calculation that showed this was no mindless beast, but a sophisticated predator that had successfully solved the puzzle of accessing the vehicle. David's survival instincts finally overcame his paralysis, and he lunged toward the driver's side door while fumbling for his bear spray. His plan was to exit the vehicle on the opposite side from the bear, and attempt to use the Explorer as a barrier while deploying his defensive spray. However, the bear's reaction time was far superior to human reflexes, and the massive animal immediately recognized David's movement as an attempt to escape. The bear launched itself through the destroyed passenger door with shocking speed and agility for something weighing nearly 3/4 of a ton. David managed to partially open the driver's door before the bear's massive paw struck him in the back, the impact lifting him completely off the driver's seat and slamming him against the dashboard with bone-crushing force. The force of the bear's strike was equivalent to being hit by a small vehicle traveling at high speed. David's ribs fractured in multiple places, his left shoulder was dislocated, and his head struck the dashboard hard enough to cause an immediate concussion that left him dazed and disoriented. The bear spray fell from his hand and rolled across the explorer's floor, now useless and beyond reach. Jake Morrison was approximately 3 minutes away from reaching the clearing when he heard David's screams echoing through the forest, followed by the unmistakable sounds of a massive animal destroying a vehicle. Jake immediately radioed for the helicopter crew to expedite their arrival and began running through the forest despite the dangerous terrain, knowing that David's survival might depend on reaching the scene within the next few minutes. The helicopter crew was now less than 4 minutes from arrival, but Captain Martinez knew from the sounds coming through the radio that they might already be too late to prevent a fatality. She coordinated with her crew to prepare for immediate deployment of emergency medical equipment and discussed the possibility of using the helicopter's rotor wash to drive the bear away from the scene. Inside the destroyed Explorer, David struggled to remain conscious as the massive bear began the process of extracting him from the vehicle. The animal's enormous strength made quick work of the remaining obstacles, with claws that could tear through metal and canvas like paper. David felt himself being dragged from the driver's seat by a force so overwhelming that resistance was impossible. The bear's method of handling prey was both efficient and brutal. The massive animal used its claws and teeth to maintain control of David's body, while simultaneously inflicting the devastating injuries that would ensure the prey could not escape. David's clothing was shredded within seconds, and deep claw marks appeared across his chest and arms as the bear established its grip. David's consciousness began to fade as blood loss and trauma shock began to affect his system. His final coherent thought was the recognition that he had fundamentally misjudged both the danger of his situation and his own ability to manage it safely. The wilderness photography expedition that was supposed to be the highlight of his Alaska adventure had become a deadly encounter with a predator operating on a scale he had never imagined possible. At 10:52 a.m., Jake Morrison emerged into the clearing where David's destroyed Explorer sat at odd angles, its frame twisted and metal panels scattered across the forest floor. The massive Kodiak bear was approximately 30 feet from the vehicle, focused entirely on its prey and seemingly unaware of the approaching human. Jake immediately assessed the scene and realized that David was still alive but badly injured and in immediate mortal danger. Jake Morrison had been preparing for this moment throughout his 15-year career as a wildlife trooper. But nothing could have adequately prepared him for the reality of confronting a 1,500-pound Kodiak bear in full predatory mode. The massive animal was focused entirely on David, who appeared to be unconscious or barely conscious and was clearly suffering from severe injuries that required immediate medical attention. Jake's training and experience immediately kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation. The bear was approximately 30 feet from the destroyed Explorer, positioned between Jake and the victim in a way that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. The animal showed no awareness of Jake's presence, being completely absorbed in its predatory behavior toward David. The standard protocol for this type of situation called for using loud noises and aggressive posturing to drive the bear away from its prey. But Jake recognized that this particular animal had already demonstrated unusual persistence and aggression. A bear that had invested this much time and energy in securing prey was unlikely to be deterred by normal bear hazing techniques. Jake positioned himself approximately 50 yards from the bear and victim, using a large spruce tree as cover while he prepared his rifle for what would likely be a critical shot. His weapon was a .375H and H Magnum, loaded with 300-grain solid bullets specifically designed for stopping dangerous game. But even with this powerful cartridge, a Kodiak bear required precise shot placement to be stopped immediately. At 10:53 a.m., Jake fired a warning shot into the air. hoping to startle the bear into abandoning its prey and withdrawing from the area. The powerful rifle shot echoed through the forest like thunder, and for a moment it seemed the strategy might work. The massive bear lifted its head and looked in Jake's direction, clearly aware for the first time that another human had entered its territory. However, instead of withdrawing as Jake had hoped, the bear's response was to become more aggressive and protective of its prey. The massive animal positioned itself directly over David's motionless form and began making the deep, threatening vocalizations that Kodiak bears use to warn off challenges to their territory or resources. The bear's message was unmistakable. It considered David to be its property and was prepared to defend that claim against any threat. Jake realized that he was dealing with an animal displaying abnormal behavior that went beyond typical predatory responses. Most bears, even when feeding, could be driven away from prey by the presence of armed humans making noise and demonstrating aggressive intent. This bear's protective behavior toward its victim suggested either extensive previous experience with humans or some form of psychological abnormality that made it unusually bold and persistent. The helicopter crew arrived overhead at 10:54 a.m., with Captain Martinez immediately assessing the scene from above while coordinating with Jake on the ground. The aerial perspective revealed the full extent of the destruction. The Explorer was completely demolished, with metal panels and debris scattered across a wide area of the forest clearing. David was visible lying motionless, approximately 20 feet from the destroyed vehicle, with the massive bear standing guard over him like a sentry protecting valuable territory. "Jake, this is Captain Martinez overhead," came the radio communication. "I can see the victim from above, and he appears to be unconscious, but possibly still breathing. The bear is positioned directly between you and the victim. Do you have a clear shot?" Jake studied the tactical situation carefully, knowing that he would likely have only one opportunity to make a successful shot before the bear either charged his position or killed David outright. The animal's size and the angle of approach meant that he needed to place his shot precisely in the brain or spine to achieve immediate incapacitation. A body shot, even with his powerful rifle, might not stop the bear quickly enough to save David's life. "Negative on the clear shot," Jake radioed back. "The bear is positioned so that any shot risks hitting the victim. I need the bear to move away from the victim before I can engage safely." Captain Martinez coordinated with her crew to attempt using the helicopter's rotor wash to drive the bear away from David's position. This technique had been used successfully in previous wildlife incidents, as most bears found the noise and wind disturbance from helicopters to be extremely intimidating and would typically withdraw from the area to avoid the perceived aerial threat. At 10:56 a.m., Captain Martinez brought her helicopter into a low hover approximately 100 feet above the clearing, directing the full force of her rotor wash toward the bear's position. The powerful downwash from the aircraft's rotors created hurricane-force winds that bent trees and scattered debris across the clearing while producing a deafening roar that echoed through the forest. The helicopter's intervention had an immediate effect on the bear's behavior, but not the effect the rescue team had hoped for. Instead of withdrawing from the area, the massive animal became even more agitated and protective, pressing closer to David's motionless form while making increasingly aggressive vocalizations toward the aircraft overhead. The bear seemed to interpret the helicopter as another threat to its prey, rather than a reason to abandon its position. More alarmingly, the rotor wash and noise seemed to trigger the bear's defensive instincts toward David, as if the animal was concerned that other predators might attempt to steal its prey. The bear began showing signs of the feeding behavior that wildlife experts most feared, the decisive actions of a predator preparing to secure its kill against interference from competitors. "Pull back the helicopter," Jake radioed urgently. "The rotor wash is making the bear more aggressive toward the victim. Captain Martinez immediately gained altitude and moved her aircraft away from directly overhead, but the damage had already been done. The bear's behavior had shifted into the final phase of predatory response, where the animal was prepared to defend its prey against any perceived threat through immediate and decisive action. Jake realized that the situation had reached the point where immediate lethal intervention was the only option for saving David's life. The bear's protective positioning and increasingly aggressive behavior meant that any further delay would likely result in the animal killing its prey to prevent interference from the perceived competitors that had appeared in its territory. At 10:58 a.m., Jake Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his career as a wildlife trooper. Using his training and 15 years of experience with dangerous game, he moved to a position approximately 40 yards from the bear and took careful aim at the massive animal's head, knowing that he would have only one chance to make a shot that could save David's life. The shot was perfect, placed precisely behind the bear's left ear and angled to penetrate the brainstem for immediate incapacitation. The powerful .375 H&H cartridge delivered devastating energy to the target, and the massive Kodiak bear collapsed instantly without any of the death throes or continued movement that might have posed additional danger to David. The forest suddenly fell silent, except for the distant sound of the helicopter overhead and Jake's own heavy breathing as he approached the scene with his rifle, ready for follow-up shots if necessary. The massive bear lay motionless beside David's still form, its enormous bulk making the human victim appear almost impossibly small and fragile by comparison. Jake immediately began emergency medical assessment and treatment while radioing for the helicopter crew to deploy their emergency medical technician. David was unconscious but still breathing, with multiple serious injuries, including apparent rib fractures, severe lacerations, possible spinal trauma, and signs of significant blood loss. His survival would depend on rapid evacuation to advanced medical facilities. Emergency medical technician Lisa Park rappelled down from the helicopter with her medical equipment and immediately began advanced life support treatment for David's injuries. Lisa had 12 years of experience with wilderness emergency medicine and had treated numerous trauma cases, but the extent of David's injuries was among the most severe she had encountered in a wilderness setting. We have multiple rib fractures, probable internal bleeding, severe lacerations requiring immediate surgical intervention, and possible spinal trauma, Lisa reported to the medical team standing by at Kodiak Island Hospital. Patient is unconscious but breathing spontaneously. We need immediate evacuation to trauma surgery. The process of preparing David for helicopter evacuation required extreme care due to the possibility of spinal injuries that could result in paralysis if handled improperly. Lisa and her team spent precious minutes immobilizing David's spine and establishing IV access for blood replacement therapy, while Jake secured the scene and documented evidence for the incident investigation that would inevitably follow. At 11:23 a.m., the helicopter lifted off from the forest clearing, with David secured in the aircraft's medical bay and Lisa providing continuous advanced life support during the flight to Kodiak Island Hospital. The flight took 18 minutes, during which David's condition remained critical but stable, giving medical personnel hope that he might survive his injuries if surgical intervention was successful. Dr. Patricia Wong, Chief of Surgery at Kodiak Island Hospital, had been alerted to the incoming trauma case and had assembled her surgical team in preparation for what promised to be a challenging operation. Dr. Wong had 15 years of trauma surgery experience, including previous cases involving wildlife attacks, but she had never treated injuries of this severity from a Kodiak bear encounter. The surgical team worked for 4 hours to repair the extensive damage caused by the bear attack. David's injuries included 6 fractured ribs, a punctured lung, severe lacerations requiring over 200 stitches, a dislocated shoulder, and significant soft tissue damage from the bear's claws. Most critically, internal bleeding from damaged organs required immediate surgical repair to prevent fatal blood loss. David remained in critical condition in the hospital's intensive care unit for 5 days following the surgery, with his survival uncertain due to complications from blood loss and the risk of infection from the contaminated wounds typical of animal attacks. His family was flown in from Oregon, and the story of his encounter with the massive Kodiak bear began attracting national media attention. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game immediately launched a comprehensive investigation into the incident, led by wildlife biologist Dr. Robert Chen and field supervisor Margaret Torres. The investigation would examine every aspect of the encounter, from the bear's unusual behavior to the circumstances that led to David becoming trapped in the remote forest clearing. Dr. Chen's preliminary examination of the massive bear revealed an animal in exceptional physical condition, with no signs of disease, injury, or malnutrition that might explain its abnormally aggressive behavior toward humans. The bear was estimated to weigh 1,483 pounds, making it one of the largest Kodiak bears ever documented and confirming that David had encountered a truly exceptional specimen. This was an adult male Kodiak bear in perfect health and at the peak of his physical capabilities, Dr. Chen reported. Bears of this size are extremely rare, representing perhaps the top 1% of the Kodiak population. The animal's behavior toward the victim was highly unusual and doesn't fit typical patterns of either defensive or predatory responses. Stomach content analysis revealed that the bear had been feeding successfully on salmon and had no apparent food stress that might have motivated predatory behavior toward humans. The animal's excellent physical condition and successful feeding patterns made its aggressive pursuit of David even more puzzling from a wildlife behavior perspective. Dental examination revealed that the bear was approximately 12 to 14 years old, placing it in the prime adult category, where bears typically display the most confident and territorial behavior. Scarring patterns on the bear's hide indicated previous encounters with other bears, suggesting an animal with significant fighting experience and dominance within the local population. The investigation team also conducted a detailed forensic analysis of the destroyed Ford Explorer, documenting the massive damage inflicted by the bear and analyzing the sequence of events that led to the vehicle's destruction. The forensic evidence provided crucial insights into Kodiak bear capabilities and the inadequacy of civilian vehicles as protection against determined predator attacks. Metallurgical analysis of the Explorer's damaged components revealed that the bear had generated forces equivalent to several tons of pressure while attacking the vehicle. Claw marks in the metal panels showed penetration depths of up to 3 inches, demonstrating the massive strength and razor-sharp claws that Kodiak bears possess. The vehicle's structural failure under the bear's attack highlighted the limitations of civilian equipment when confronted with apex predators. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the wildlife behaviorist who analyzed David's photographs and video recordings from the encounter, identified several factors that may have contributed to the bear's unusual persistence and aggression. The combination of the bear's exceptional size, prime territorial location during salmon season, and possible previous conditioning to human presence created a perfect storm of factors that led to predatory stalking behavior. The investigation revealed that the massive bear had been sighted in the area for several weeks prior to the incident, with multiple reports from pilots, fishermen, and other lodge guests describing an unusually large and bold animal that showed less fear of human presence than typical for Kodiak bears. This pattern suggested that the bear may have been gradually becoming accustomed to human activity in its territory. Tyler Brooks, the National Geographic photographer who had provided David with the GPS coordinates for the Salmon Falls location, was interviewed extensively about his previous encounters with the bear. Tyler reported that during his multiple visits to photograph the bear, he had noticed increasingly bold behavior and what seemed like growing curiosity about human observers. The first time I photographed him, the bear maintained typical distance and seemed to deliberately avoid areas where he could detect human scent, Tyler explained to investigators. But over the course of several visits, I noticed he was becoming less cautious and more willing to remain in areas where humans had been present. I thought this was positive from a photography perspective, but looking back, it may have indicated problematic habituation. The concept of bear habituation to human presence was a critical factor in understanding the incident. Wildlife experts explained that bears who lose their natural fear of humans often progress through predictable behavioral stages, beginning with tolerance of human presence and potentially culminating in viewing humans as either competitors or prey opportunities. Dr. Marcus Webb's behavioral analysis concluded that the massive bear had likely progressed to viewing humans as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided. The bear's methodical stalking behavior, systematic assessment of the vehicle's vulnerabilities, and persistent attack despite multiple deterrence attempts all indicate predatory motivation rather than defensive aggression. This conclusion had significant implications for wildlife management policies on Kodiak Island, as it suggested that even healthy, well-fed bears could develop dangerous associations with human activity if habituation was allowed to progress unchecked. The incident prompted immediate policy changes regarding bear monitoring and intervention protocols for animals, showing signs of human habituation. The media coverage of David's bear encounter began within hours of his rescue and quickly escalated to national and international attention as details of the incident became public. The combination of dramatic circumstances, compelling photography, and the exceptional size of the bear created a story that captured public imagination while raising important questions about wilderness tourism safety. CNN, Fox News, National Geographic, and numerous other media organizations sent reporters to Kodiak Island to cover the story, interviewing local residents, wildlife experts, and tourism officials about the implications of the attack. The coverage focused heavily on the massive size of the bear and the extent of destruction it had caused to David's vehicle, with many outlets emphasizing the almost incredible nature of the encounter. Kodiak Island Bear Attack Survivor Speaks Out became a recurring headline as David gradually recovered enough to participate in interviews from his hospital bed. His articulate description of the encounter, combined with the dramatic photographs he had captured during the incident, provided compelling content that sustained media interest for several weeks. The story resonated particularly strongly with outdoor enthusiasts and wilderness photographers, many of whom recognized themselves in David's situation and circumstances. Online forums and social media platforms were filled with discussions about the incident, with many people sharing their own bear encounter stories and debating the appropriate safety measures for wilderness photography. However, the media attention also brought scrutiny to David's decisions and actions leading up to the encounter. Some critics argued that he had been reckless in pursuing photography opportunities in known bear territory, despite multiple warnings from local residents and wildlife officials. Others defended his actions as reasonable, given his experience and safety preparations. The tourism industry on Kodiak Island faced immediate challenges as the widely publicized bear attack raised concerns among potential visitors about safety risks associated with wilderness activities. Lodge owners, guide services, and charter operators reported numerous cancellations and inquiries about safety protocols in the weeks following the incident. Maggie Chen, owner of Emerald Bay Lodge, where David had been staying, found herself fielding constant media inquiries about her safety protocols and the warnings she had provided to David before his fatal encounter. We provided extensive briefings about bear safety, marked dangerous areas on maps, and strongly recommended staying close to the lodge, Maggie explained to reporters. But ultimately, guests are responsible for their own decisions about risk management in wilderness areas. The incident sparked broader discussions within Alaska's tourism industry about liability, safety protocols, and the balance between providing authentic wilderness experiences while protecting visitors from dangerous wildlife encounters. Industry associations began developing enhanced safety standards and training programs for tourism operators working in bear country. Insurance companies also took notice of the incident, with several major carriers beginning to reassess their coverage policies for wilderness tourism operations. The extensive damage to David's rental vehicle, combined with his substantial medical expenses and potential liability issues, highlighted financial risks that had previously been underestimated by the insurance industry. Sarah Martinez at the Anchorage Rental Car Agency found herself at the center of media attention as reporters investigated the adequacy of safety briefings provided to tourists renting vehicles for wilderness travel. We provide comprehensive information about wildlife risks and driving safety, Sarah explained, but we're not wilderness guides or wildlife experts. Our role is to rent vehicles and provide basic safety information. The rental car industry began examining its responsibilities and liabilities when vehicles were used for wilderness access in areas with known wildlife hazards. Several companies implemented enhanced safety briefing requirements and began requiring customers to acknowledge specific risks associated with driving in remote areas of Alaska. David's recovery process was lengthy and complicated, requiring multiple surgical procedures and extensive rehabilitation therapy. The physical injuries from his bear encounter were severe enough, but the psychological trauma proved equally challenging to overcome. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma psychologist specializing in wildlife attack survivors, began working with David during his hospital stay to address the post-traumatic stress symptoms that were interfering with his recovery. Survivors of predator attacks often experience a fundamental shift in their relationship with the natural world, Dr. Walsh explained. The sense of safety and confidence that allows people to enjoy wilderness activities can be permanently altered by encounters where they become prey rather than observer. David struggled with recurring nightmares, panic attacks triggered by loud sounds or sudden movements, and a profound anxiety about being outdoors that was devastating for someone whose passion had always been wilderness photography. His recovery required not only healing from physical injuries, but rebuilding his psychological relationship with the natural world that had nearly killed him. 3 weeks after the attack, David was stable enough to participate in a detailed interview with Alaska State Trooper investigators, providing crucial first-hand testimony about the sequence of events leading to his encounter with the massive bear. His account, combined with the photographic and video evidence he had captured, provided the most complete documentation of Kodiak bear predatory behavior ever recorded. I kept thinking the bear would lose interest and move away, like every other bear encounter I'd experienced, David told investigators. I never imagined an animal could be that persistent and methodical in pursuing a human inside a vehicle. It was like being hunted by something that understood exactly what it was doing. David's photographs from the encounter became valuable scientific documents, providing researchers with unprecedented detailed images of Kodiak bear facial expressions, body language, and behavioral sequences during predatory stalking. Several wildlife research institutions requested access to his images for studies on bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict. The legal ramifications of the incident began emerging as David's medical bills exceeded $400,000, and his inability to work extended into months rather than weeks. Questions arose about liability for the incident, with potential claims against various parties, including the rental car agency, the lodge, the photographer who provided location information, and government agencies responsible for wildlife management. David's attorney, Patricia Morrison, no relation to wildlife trooper Jake Morrison, began investigating potential negligence claims while acknowledging the complex legal landscape surrounding wilderness tourism and wildlife encounters. This case raises fundamental questions about responsibility and liability when tourists are injured by wildlife in Alaska, Morrison explained. The legal framework for these situations is still evolving. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game faced scrutiny over their wildlife management policies, particularly regarding the monitoring and intervention protocols for bears showing signs of human habituation. Critics argued that the agency should have taken more aggressive action to relocate or remove the massive bear before it progressed to predatory behavior toward humans. Dr. Robert Chen defended the agency's policies, explaining that wildlife management decisions must balance public safety with conservation goals and scientific understanding of animal behavior. "We can't relocate or destroy every large bear that shows tolerance of human presence," Dr. Chen argued. "The challenge is identifying which animals pose genuine threats versus those that are simply adapting to increased human activity in their habitat." The incident prompted legislative hearings in the Alaska State Legislature, where lawmakers examined wildlife management policies, tourism safety regulations, and emergency response capabilities for remote areas. Several bills were introduced requiring enhanced safety briefings for wilderness tourists and improved coordination between wildlife agencies and tourism operators. Senator Margaret Williams, who chaired the legislative committee investigating the incident, emphasized the need for balanced policies that protected both human safety and Alaska's valuable wildlife resources. "We need to find ways to allow people to experience Alaska's incredible wilderness while minimizing the risks of dangerous wildlife encounters," Senator Williams stated. The emergency response to David's bear attack was extensively reviewed by multiple agencies, with generally positive assessments of the coordination and effectiveness of rescue operations. The rapid deployment of helicopter resources and the successful medical evacuation were credited with saving David's life, though questions were raised about communication protocols and resource positioning for remote area emergencies. Wildlife trooper Jake Morrison received commendations for his actions during the incident, but he also struggled with the psychological impact of having to kill such a magnificent animal to save human life. "That bear was one of the most impressive wildlife specimens I've ever encountered," Jake reflected. "Having to destroy an animal like that, even to save human life, stays with you." The death of the massive bear was mourned by wildlife enthusiasts and conservation organizations who viewed the loss of such an exceptional specimen as a tragedy that might have been prevented through better wildlife management policies. Some groups called for enhanced monitoring and intervention protocols that could identify problematic bears before they progressed to attacking humans. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the marine biologist who had been staying at Emerald Bay Lodge during David's visit, became an advocate for improved wildlife-human conflict prevention measures. "This incident represents a failure of our systems to protect both humans and wildlife," Dr. Vasquez argued. "We need better monitoring, earlier intervention, and more sophisticated understanding of how human activities affect wildlife behavior." The incident contributed to ongoing scientific research about predator behavior, habituation processes, and human-wildlife conflict in Alaska's changing environment. Climate change, increased tourism, and evolving wildlife populations were creating new challenges for managing interactions between humans and large predators. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's behavioral analysis of the bear attack became a foundational document for wildlife management agencies throughout North America, providing detailed insights into the progression from normal bear behavior to predatory stalking of humans. Her research identified warning signs that could help predict when bears were becoming dangerously habituated to human presence. The forensic analysis of David's destroyed Ford Explorer led to significant changes in vehicle rental policies for wilderness areas, with several companies beginning to offer vehicles with enhanced wildlife protection features, including reinforced doors, emergency communication equipment, and bear-resistant storage compartments. Automotive manufacturers also took notice of the incident, with some companies beginning research into vehicle designs specifically intended for use in areas with large predator populations. The market for such vehicles was limited, but the dramatic nature of David's encounter highlighted gaps in current vehicle capabilities for wilderness use. 6 months after the attack, David had recovered enough from his physical injuries to return to limited work activities, though his psychological recovery remained ongoing. He had decided to sell his photography equipment and abandon wilderness photography, finding that even looking at images of natural environments triggered anxiety and panic responses. "I loved wilderness photography for 20 years. David explained in a follow-up interview. "It was my passion, my creative outlet, and my escape from the stress of daily life. But I can't separate those positive associations from the memory of being hunted by that bear. Every forest image brings back the feeling of being prey." David's case became a subject of study for trauma psychologists specializing in outdoor recreation injuries, contributing to improved understanding of how predator attacks affect survivors' relationships with natural environments. His experience highlighted the importance of psychological support services for wilderness accident victims. The incident also influenced David's family relationships, as his parents and siblings struggled to understand his decision to pursue wilderness photography in dangerous areas. Family therapy sessions helped address the guilt and recrimination that often follows traumatic incidents involving risky recreational activities. David's wife, Maria, whom he had married 2 years before the Alaska trip, found herself dealing with her own trauma from nearly losing her husband to a preventable accident. "I supported his photography passion because it made him happy," Maria explained. "But I never understood the real risks he was taking until I almost lost him." The couple's relationship required significant adjustment as they worked to rebuild their life together around David's changed capabilities and interests. The incident forced difficult conversations about risk, responsibility, and the balance between personal fulfillment and family obligations. 1 year after the bear attack, a comprehensive review of the incident was published jointly by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the National Park Service, and several wildlife research organizations. The review identified multiple factors that contributed to the tragic encounter and made recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future. The review's recommendations included enhanced monitoring systems for bears showing signs of human habituation, improved communication protocols between wildlife agencies and tourism operators, upgraded safety equipment requirements for wilderness vehicle rentals, and expanded emergency response capabilities for remote areas of Alaska. Implementation of these recommendations began immediately, with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game receiving additional funding for bear monitoring programs and the tourism industry adopting enhanced safety protocols for wilderness activities. The changes were seen as David's lasting legacy from his traumatic encounter with the massive Kodiak bear. The site where David's encounter occurred was permanently closed to public access, with the area designated as a wildlife research zone where scientists could study bear behavior without human interference. A memorial plaque honoring the massive bear that was killed during the incident was installed at the Kodiak Island Visitor Center, acknowledging the tragic loss of an exceptional wildlife specimen. Tyler Brooks, the National Geographic photographer whose location information had led David to the encounter site, left wildlife photography following the incident and began working as a wildlife conservation advocate. "I can't help feeling responsible for what happened to David," Tyler explained. "If I hadn't shared those GPS coordinates, he would never have been in that clearing when the bear was hunting." Tyler's career change reflected the broader impact of the incident on the wildlife photography community, with many professionals reassessing their safety protocols and risk management approaches. Several photography organizations developed new safety standards and training programs specifically addressing the risks of photographing large predators. The massive bear that attacked David was preserved by taxidermists and became part of a wildlife education display at the University of Alaska, where it serves as a teaching tool for students studying wildlife biology and human-wildlife conflict. The display includes detailed information about the incident and the factors that led to the tragic encounter. Visitors to the display are often struck by the bear's enormous size and physical perfection, making it easier to understand how such an animal could overpower a vehicle and its human occupant. The educational value of the display helps ensure that David's traumatic experience contributes to preventing similar incidents in the future. Dr. Robert Chen continued his research on Kodiak bear behavior using data collected from David's encounter, publishing several scientific papers that advanced understanding of predator psychology and habituation processes. His work contributed to improved wildlife management strategies throughout Alaska and other regions with large predator populations. The incident became a case study in multiple academic disciplines, from wildlife biology and psychology to tourism management and emergency response planning. David's detailed documentation of his encounter provided researchers with unprecedented data about human responses to predator attacks and the effectiveness of various safety measures. 2 years after the attack, David made his first return visit to Alaska, though he stayed in Anchorage and avoided any wilderness areas. The trip was part of his ongoing therapy process, helping him confront his fears while maintaining appropriate safety boundaries. He visited the memorial plaque honoring the bear that had nearly killed him, describing the experience as both painful and healing. "I needed to acknowledge that magnificent animal and the role I played in its death," David explained. "That bear wasn't evil or malicious. It was just being a bear in its own territory. My choices led to a confrontation that ended tragically for both of us." David's perspective on the incident evolved significantly during his recovery process, moving from anger and trauma toward a more nuanced understanding of the complex factors that had contributed to the encounter. His insights became valuable for other wilderness accident survivors dealing with similar psychological challenges. The incident continued to influence wildlife management policies and tourism safety practices throughout North America, with David's case frequently cited in discussions about human-wildlife conflict prevention. His experience served as a powerful reminder of the risks inherent in wilderness tourism and the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of large predators. The Ford Explorer destroyed in the attack was eventually recovered from the forest clearing and became part of a safety demonstration used by vehicle rental companies to educate customers about wilderness risks. The extent of damage inflicted by the bear served as a dramatic illustration of the limitations of civilian vehicles when confronted with determined predators. 3 years after the incident, David had largely recovered from his physical injuries, but continued to deal with psychological effects that limited his outdoor activities. He had found new career fulfillment in software development focused on emergency communication systems, channeling his wilderness knowledge into technology that could help other outdoor enthusiasts stay safe. David's work on emergency communication apps was inspired by his experience of being trapped in a remote location with limited rescue options. His software innovations contributed to improved emergency response capabilities for wilderness areas throughout Alaska and other remote regions. The incident's impact on Kodiak Island's tourism industry proved to be temporary, with visitor numbers returning to previous levels within 2 years as enhanced safety measures restored confidence in wilderness activities. The improved safety protocols implemented following David's attack were credited with preventing several potentially dangerous wildlife encounters. Maggie Chen's Emerald Bay Lodge became a model for wildlife safety practices in Alaska's tourism industry, with her comprehensive safety protocols and guest education programs being adopted by other wilderness accommodation providers. The lodge's reputation for both excellent wilderness access and rigorous safety standards attracted visitors who valued responsible wildlife tourism. Dr. Patricia Wong, the trauma surgeon who had saved David's life, continued to treat wildlife attack victims and became an advocate for improved emergency medical capabilities in Alaska's remote areas. Her experience with David's case contributed to enhanced trauma care protocols that improved survival rates for serious wilderness injuries. The helicopter crew that had rescued David received recognition for their professional response under difficult conditions, with Captain Sarah Martinez being awarded the Alaska Public Safety Award for her role in coordinating the successful rescue operation. The incident became a training case study for emergency helicopter crews throughout Alaska. Wildlife trooper Jake Morrison eventually returned to his normal duties, but was profoundly affected by his role in the incident. His experience became the basis for enhanced training programs for wildlife officers dealing with dangerous predator encounters, helping other officers prepare for similar life and death situations. The scientific knowledge gained from David's bear encounter contributed to research projects throughout North America, with his photographic documentation providing unprecedented insights into Kodiak bear behavior during predatory stalking. The data collected from the incident advanced understanding of how large predators assess and pursue human prey. 5 years after the attack, David had achieved a level of psychological recovery that allowed him to enjoy limited outdoor activities, though he continued to avoid wilderness areas with large predator populations. His recovery process became a model for trauma therapy programs helping other wilderness accident survivors. The massive Kodiak bear that had attacked David was posthumously designated as one of the largest specimens ever documented, with its preserved remains contributing to ongoing research about the maximum size potential of North America's largest predators. The bear's exceptional size helped explain the unprecedented destruction it had inflicted on David's vehicle. David's case continued to influence legal precedents regarding liability for wilderness tourism incidents, with courts citing his experience in decisions about responsibility and negligence in outdoor recreation accidents. The complex factors involved in his encounter highlighted the challenges of assigning blame when humans and wildlife interact in unpredictable ways. The incident's lasting impact on David's life was profound, but not entirely negative, as his experience led to meaningful career changes and advocacy work that helped improve safety for other wilderness enthusiasts. His transformation from wilderness photographer to emergency communication innovator demonstrated the possibility of finding purpose and meaning even after traumatic experiences. The story of David Ramirez and the giant Kodiak bear that nearly killed him became one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed wildlife attacks in North American history, providing valuable lessons about the risks and rewards of human interaction with the natural world. The incident served as a powerful reminder that wilderness experiences, while enriching and transformative, carry real risks that require careful consideration and respect for the power of wild animals. The comprehensive investigation and analysis of David's encounter contributed to improved understanding of predator behavior, enhanced safety protocols for wilderness tourism, and better emergency response capabilities for remote areas. His traumatic experience, while devastating on a personal level, ultimately helped make wilderness activities safer for countless other outdoor enthusiasts. The incident concluded not with simple answers or easy blame, but with a complex understanding of the many factors that contributed to a tragic collision between human ambition and natural predation. David's survival and recovery demonstrated human resilience, while the death of the massive bear reminded everyone involved of the costs when careful boundaries between humans and wildlife are crossed. The legacy of August 9th, 2024 continued to influence wildlife management, tourism safety, and emergency response planning throughout Alaska and beyond, ensuring that the lessons learned from David's encounter with the giant Kodiak bear would help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The incident stood as a testament to both the magnificent power of Alaska's wildlife and the importance of respecting that power through appropriate caution and preparation. The next stories. Grizzly bear devours. Priest. During outdoor sermon, July 12, 2024. The morning mist clung to the Lamar Valley like a shroud as Father Michael Joseph O'Connor adjusted his white collar one final time before stepping out of the chartered bus. At 63, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent 4 decades shepherding souls through life's most treacherous passages. His weathered hands, marked by liver spots and the faint tremor of early Parkinson's, gripped his worn leather Bible with the reverence of a knight clutching his sword. Behind him, 84 members of St. Catherine's Parish in Billings, Montana, filed out into the crisp July air, their excited chatter creating a symphony of anticipation that would, within hours, transform into screams of terror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The idea for an outdoor worship service in Yellowstone National Park had come to Father O'Connor during a particularly vivid dream 3 months earlier. In that nocturnal vision, he had seen himself standing before a natural amphitheater, the Rocky Mountains serving as his cathedral walls, delivering a sermon about God's creation to his flock, surrounded by the pristine wilderness that the Almighty had crafted with his own hands. The dream had felt so real, so divinely inspired, that he had awakened at 3 in the morning and immediately begun sketching plans in the margins of his prayer book. By dawn, he had convinced himself that this outdoor service would be his masterpiece, a culmination of his ministerial career that would bring his parishioners closer to the divine than any man-made sanctuary ever could. What Father O'Connor could not have known, as he gazed across the golden grasslands that stretched toward the distant peaks, was that less than 2 miles away, a massive grizzly bear known to park biologists as Bear 291 was concluding a 20-hour feeding session on an elk carcass. The 12-year-old male, weighing nearly 800 pounds and standing 4 feet tall at the shoulder, had been tracked by wildlife researchers for 6 years. His radio collar, now buried beneath layers of thick brown fur, had been recording increasingly aggressive territorial behavior throughout the summer of 2024. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife biologist monitoring Bear 291, had noted in her field reports that the animal showed signs of heightened stress, likely due to drought conditions that had dramatically reduced his normal food sources. The berry crops had failed, Salmon runs were depleted, and competition with other bears had intensified to dangerous levels. Margaret Sullivan, 78 years old, and the parish's most devoted member, had been among the first to sign up for the Wilderness Worship Service. She had buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children, finding solace in Father O'Connor's gentle guidance through each tragedy and triumph. Her arthritic fingers clutched a thermos of coffee as she watched the priest survey their chosen location, a natural clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that created an almost perfect circle of open space. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with divine purpose. Margaret had brought her great-granddaughter, Emma Rodriguez, a 16-year-old whose faith had been wavering since her parents' divorce. She hoped this extraordinary service would rekindle the girl's spiritual flame. Emma Rodriguez stood apart from the adults, her attention divided between her smartphone, which showed no signal bars in this remote location, and the overwhelming grandeur of the wilderness around her. At 16, she possessed the typical teenager's conviction that she was invincible, coupled with a growing skepticism about organized religion that had developed during her parents' bitter separation. Her mother, Maria Rodriguez, a 42-year-old nurse at Billings General Hospital, had insisted she attend this service, hoping it would provide some stability during what had been a turbulent year. Maria herself struggled with faith, but she recognized Father O'Connor's genuine compassion and believed his influence might help her daughter navigate the complexities of adolescence. The clearing Father O'Connor had selected sat approximately 3 miles northeast of the main Lamar Valley Road, accessible only by a narrow hiking trail that wound through dense forest before opening into the meadow. Park rangers had initially expressed reservations about issuing the special use permit for such a large gathering in known grizzly habitat. But Father O'Connor's reputation in the community and his congregation's track record of responsible outdoor activities had eventually swayed the decision. The permit specifically required the group to maintain a minimum distance of 100 yards from any wildlife, carry bear spray, and conclude their service by noon to avoid peak animal activity periods. James Mitchell, a 47-year-old hunting guide and the parish's unofficial outdoorsman, had volunteered to serve as the group's wildlife safety coordinator. His 17 years of experience in Montana's backcountry had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated predator presence. Disturbed vegetation, scat composition, territorial markings, and the nervous behavior of prey animals. As the congregation gathered in the clearing, Mitchell conducted a careful perimeter check, noting the fresh deer tracks that crisscrossed the area and the remains of what appeared to be an old elk kill site, approximately 50 yards to the northwest. His trained eye observed that the bones had been recently disturbed, suggesting large scavenger activity within the past 24 hours, but the signs were not immediately alarming enough to warrant calling off the service. Dr. Robert Hayes, a 55-year-old retired physician who had served the parish as a volunteer medical advisor for over a decade, unpacked a comprehensive first aid kit from his hiking backpack. His medical bag contained everything from basic bandages to emergency medications, though nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the catastrophic trauma that would soon unfold before his eyes. Hayes had treated hunting accidents, hiking injuries, and various wilderness emergencies during his years as an emergency room physician. But the savagery he would witness this day would challenge every assumption he held about survivable injuries and the limits of human endurance. The congregation arranged itself in a loose semicircle facing a natural raised area where Father O'Connor planned to deliver his sermon. The elderly members, including Margaret Sullivan and her friend Dorothy Kowalski, settled onto portable chairs they had carried in their hiking packs. The younger parishioners, including teenagers like Emma Rodriguez and her friend Jessica Park, sat cross-legged on blankets spread across the soft grass. Parents position themselves strategically to keep watch over their children while still maintaining a clear view of their beloved priest. Catherine Walsh, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher and mother of twin 8-year-old boys, had brought her sons, Timothy and Patrick, on their first wilderness adventure. The boys were fascinated by every sound, every movement in the surrounding forest, their young minds cataloguing each new experience with the intensity that only children possess. Catherine's husband, David Walsh, a construction foreman, had remained skeptical about bringing such young children into potential bear country, but Father O'Connor's assurance that proper safety measures would be followed had eventually convinced him to support the family's participation. As the morning progressed toward the planned 10 o'clock service time, the wildlife in the area began exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior that would later be recognized as clear warning signs of an apex predator's proximity. A family of mule deer that had been grazing peacefully in an adjacent meadow suddenly raised their heads in unison, their ears rotating like radar dishes before they bounded away with the explosive energy that indicates imminent danger. A red-tailed hawk circling overhead released a series of sharp warning calls before veering away toward the valley floor. Most tellingly, the normal chorus of songbirds that had provided a pleasant soundtrack to the congregation's arrival fell completely silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Bear 291 had been tracking the human scent for nearly an hour, his powerful nose capable of detecting the congregation's presence from over a mile away. The combination of unfamiliar sounds, concentrated human odor, and the disruption to his established territorial patterns triggered a complex sequence of behavioral responses that wildlife biologists would later classify as defensive aggression, escalating toward predatory behavior. The bear's movements through the forest demonstrated the careful stalking pattern of an animal assessing a potential threat, while simultaneously evaluating the possibility of claiming new territory or food sources. Father O'Connor began his service with a reading from Genesis, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing as he spoke about God's creation of the natural world. His sermon, carefully prepared over weeks of study and prayer, focused on humanity's responsibility as stewards of the divine creation surrounding them. The irony of his chosen theme would not be lost on survivors who would later struggle to reconcile their faith with the savage reality of nature's indifferent brutality. As he spoke about the beauty and wonder of God's wilderness, the priest's eyes sparkled with genuine joy and reverence, completely unaware that death was methodically approaching through the tree line. The attack began at exactly 10:47 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, according to multiple witness accounts and the timestamp on Jessica Park's smartphone, which had been recording Father O'Connor's sermon as a keepsake for her grandmother, who was too frail to make the trip. The first indication of danger was not the bear itself, but the explosive crash of breaking branches as 800 pounds of predator burst through the forest edge at a full charge, covering the 60-yard distance to the congregation in less than 4 seconds. Margaret Sullivan would later tell investigators that her first thought was that a freight train had somehow materialized in the wilderness. Such was the thunderous noise of the bear's approach. The massive grizzly emerged from the tree line, like a living avalanche, its silver-tipped brown fur rippling over muscles that had been honed by 12 years of surviving in one of North America's most challenging environments. Its head, massive beyond anything the congregation had seen in zoos or documentaries, swayed from side to side as its small, intelligent eyes locked onto the largest concentration of humans. Emma Rodriguez, positioned near the center of the gathering, would remember with crystalline clarity the moment when collective human awareness shifted from peaceful worship to primal terror. The change happened like a wave spreading through the crowd, beginning with James Mitchell's sharp intake of breath and his urgent shout of "Grizzly!" Everyone down. The warning came too late to prevent the chaos that followed, but early enough to save several lives as parishioners threw themselves flat against the ground or scrambled for the limited cover provided by scattered boulders and fallen logs. Father O'Connor, positioned prominently at the front of the congregation, became the bear's primary target through a combination of his central location, his upright posture, and perhaps most critically, his instinctive decision to stand his ground rather than run. Wildlife behaviorists would later theorize that the priest's failure to immediately flee or assume a submissive posture may have triggered the bear's predatory response, as most animals interpret such behavior as either a challenge to dominance or an indication of weakness worthy of exploitation. The grizzly's initial charge carried it directly toward the priest with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Father O'Connor had perhaps 2 seconds to process what was happening before 800 pounds of apex predator collided with his frail 63-year-old frame. Witnesses would later describe the impact as resembling a freight train hitting a scarecrow, the priest's body ragdolling through the air before crashing to the ground 15 feet from where he had been standing. Dr. Robert Hayes, positioned approximately 20 feet to Father O'Connor's left, found himself with an unobstructed view of the attack's initial moments. His medical training allowed him to observe and later document details that other witnesses missed or suppressed. The bear's first swipe, delivered with a forepaw the size of a dinner plate, connected with the priest's left shoulder and chest, the 4-inch claws penetrating through clothing, skin, and muscle to scrape against ribs and possibly puncture lung tissue. The sound, Hayes would tell investigators, was unlike anything in his medical experience, a wet, tearing noise accompanied by the crack of breaking bones. Father O'Connor's scream, when it came, lasted only a few seconds before being cut short as the bear's massive jaws closed around his torso. The grizzly's bite force, capable of crushing a bowling ball, compressed the priest's ribcage, while 64 razor-sharp teeth punctured skin and organs. Witnesses closest to the attack reported hearing what sounded like branches breaking, though they later realized they were listening to the systematic destruction of Father O'Connor's skeletal structure. Margaret Sullivan, despite her advanced age, demonstrated remarkable presence of mind by grabbing her great-granddaughter Emma and pulling the teenager behind a large boulder that provided partial concealment from the carnage unfolding mere yards away. From their hiding place, both women could hear every sound of the attack, the bear's huffing breath, the wet sounds of flesh being torn, and most horrifically, Father O'Connor's weakening attempts to pray aloud even as his life ebbed away. The priest's final words, according to multiple witnesses, were fragments of the Lord's Prayer delivered in a voice growing progressively weaker as massive blood loss and traumatic shock overwhelmed his system. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be." Each word came with increasing difficulty as the bear continued its savage assault, treating the elderly man's body like a rag doll. The juxtaposition of sacred prayer with primal violence would haunt survivors for years to come, challenging their fundamental beliefs about divine protection and the nature of God's creation. James Mitchell, drawing upon his extensive hunting experience, recognized that the bear's behavior had transitioned from defensive aggression to active predation. The grizzly was not simply neutralizing a perceived threat, it was claiming and consuming prey. This realization filled Mitchell with a horror that transcended mere fear for physical safety, as he understood that Father O'Connor was being eaten alive while still conscious. Mitchell's knowledge of bear behavior told him that intervention would likely result in additional fatalities, but his moral obligation to attempt a rescue warred with his survival instincts. The hunting guide's internal conflict lasted only seconds before training overcame emotion. He began making loud noises and throwing rocks at the bear, while slowly backing toward the tree line, hoping to draw the animal's attention away from the priest without triggering a secondary attack on the fleeing congregation. His bear spray, a canister containing concentrated capsaicin powerful enough to temporarily disable even large predators, remained clipped to his belt as he recognized that using it effectively would require getting dangerously close to the attacking grizzly. Catherine Walsh gathered her twin sons with the fierce protectiveness that only maternal instinct can provide, shielding their eyes from the horror while pushing them toward the forest edge. 8-year-old Timothy Walsh would later tell counselors that his last clear memory before his mother blocked his view was seeing the big brown dog playing too rough with Father Mike, his young mind unable to process the reality of what he was witnessing. His brother Patrick would have no conscious memory of the attack itself, but would develop severe nightmares featuring a monster with big teeth that would require years of therapy to resolve. Dr. Hayes found himself torn between his medical oath to provide aid and the stark reality that approaching the bear would accomplish nothing beyond adding another victim to the tragedy. His trained eye assessed Father O'Connor's injuries with clinical detachment, cataloguing trauma that was far beyond any possibility of survival, even with immediate advanced medical intervention. The priest's chest cavity had been crushed, major blood vessels severed, and vital organs punctured or destroyed. Death, when it came, would be a mercy rather than a loss of a salvageable life. The bear's feeding behavior continued for approximately 4 minutes that stretched into subjective hours for the terrified witnesses. Grizzly 291 demonstrated the methodical efficiency that had allowed his species to survive as apex predators for millennia, using his powerful jaws to access the most nutritious organs, while his claws held the prey immobile. The sounds of consumption, wet tearing, bone cracking, and the bear's satisfied huffing would echo in survivors' nightmares for decades to come. Maria Rodriguez, positioned near the rear of the congregation, used the chaos to gather other children and shepherd them toward a game trail that led back toward the main hiking path. Her nursing experience had taught her to function under pressure, and she instinctively took charge of evacuation efforts while Mitchell attempted to distract the bear. Her daughter Emma, however, remained frozen behind the boulder with Margaret Sullivan, both women transfixed by the horror unfolding before them, despite their desperate desire to look away. The bear's behavior during the attack would later provide valuable data for wildlife biologists studying predatory versus defensive aggression in grizzlies. Rather than inflicting damage and withdrawing, as would be typical in a defensive encounter, Bear 291 claimed the kill site and began consuming his prey immediately. This indicated a significant behavioral shift that raised serious questions about the factors that had driven this particular animal to view humans as potential food sources rather than threats to be avoided. Father O'Connor's death occurred approximately 6 minutes after the initial attack, based on medical testimony and witness accounts. Dr. Hayes, observing from his concealed position, noted the moment when the priest's struggles ceased and his body became completely limp. The exact cause of death would later be listed as massive hemorrhaging combined with traumatic shock, though the attending medical examiner would note that the victim had sustained injuries that would have individually proven fatal within minutes. The bear's continued feeding created an agonizing dilemma for the surviving congregation members. Leaving immediately offered the best chance of avoiding additional casualties, but departing would mean abandoning their beloved priest's remains to complete consumption by the predator. Several of the men, including David Walsh and Michael Torres, a 44-year-old mechanic, discussed attempting to drive the bear away using noise and thrown objects, but Mitchell's urgent warnings about the futility and danger of such efforts prevented what would likely have resulted in multiple additional fatalities. Jessica Park, the teenager who had been recording the service, found that her smartphone had captured the entire attack in horrifying detail. The 43-minute video file would later become crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation, while simultaneously serving as a source of ongoing trauma for survivors who could not erase the images from their memories. Park's initial instinct to stop recording was overridden by a strange compulsion to document the unprecedented event, a decision that would haunt her with guilt over whether she should have attempted to help instead of serving as a passive observer. The congregation's evacuation began approximately 8 minutes after the attack commenced, initiated when Mitchell determined that the bear had become sufficiently focused on feeding to allow for careful withdrawal. The retreat followed a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to minimize noise and sudden movements that might reattract the predator's attention. Parents carried small children, while older congregants like Margaret Sullivan were assisted by younger adults, creating a slow-moving procession that prioritized stealth over speed. Dorothy Kowalski, Margaret's 74-year-old friend, suffered a mild heart attack during the evacuation, the cardiac event triggered by the extreme stress and exertion of the retreat. Dr. Hayes was forced to make the agonizing decision between staying to provide medical care and continuing the evacuation that might save multiple lives. His choice to continue moving while providing basic cardiac support during the withdrawal would later be vindicated by emergency medical specialists who confirmed that remaining at the attack site would have accomplished nothing beyond creating additional casualties. The hike back to the trailhead normally required 45 minutes, but the traumatized congregation completed the journey in just over an hour despite their emotional state and the need to assist several members who were struggling with the physical and psychological demands of the retreat. The group's silence during the evacuation was broken only by muffled sobbing and the whispered prayers of those seeking divine comfort in the aftermath of witnessing such savage violence. Emma Rodriguez would later describe the evacuation as surreal, her mind struggling to process the transition from peaceful worship to primal survival. The same forest that had seemed beautiful and welcoming an hour earlier now appeared threatening and malevolent, every shadow potentially concealing another predator, every sound a potential herald of additional danger. Her great-grandmother Margaret, despite her advanced age, demonstrated remarkable resilience, using her lifetime of experience with tragedy to provide comfort and guidance to younger congregation members who were struggling to cope with what they had witnessed. The first emergency call was placed at 11:52 a.m. by James Mitchell, using a satellite communication device he carried for hunting emergencies. His initial report to Park County Emergency Services was necessarily brief, but conveyed the essential information. A fatal grizzly attack had occurred in the Lamar Valley, one confirmed fatality, no additional injuries requiring immediate medical intervention, and approximately 85 witnesses who would need evacuation and psychological support. Park County Sheriff's Deputy Angela Martinez was the first law enforcement officer to respond to the emergency call. Her initial assessment, radioed to dispatch at 12:14 p.m., confirmed the basic facts while requesting immediate backup from both the National Park Service and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Martinez, a 12-year veteran with extensive experience in wilderness emergencies, recognized that this incident would require coordination between multiple agencies and careful management of both the immediate rescue efforts and the longer-term investigation that would inevitably follow. Dr. Sarah Chen, the wildlife biologist who had been monitoring Bear 291, received notification of the attack at 12:21 p.m. while conducting field research approximately 15 miles from the incident site. Her immediate reaction combined professional concern with personal anguish as she recognized that her research subject had crossed a behavioral threshold that would almost certainly result in the animal's destruction. Chen's detailed knowledge of Bear 291's movement patterns and recent behavior would prove invaluable in the subsequent investigation, though she would struggle with questions about whether earlier intervention might have prevented the tragedy. The National Park Service's initial response team, led by Chief Ranger William Hawthorne, arrived at the trailhead at 1:17 p.m., equipped with both rescue gear and weapons capable of dealing with dangerous wildlife. Hawthorne, a 22-year veteran of park law enforcement, had responded to numerous bear encounters but had never dealt with a confirmed fatal attack involving such a large number of witnesses. His primary concerns focused on securing the attack site, ensuring the safety of potential rescue personnel, and beginning the complex process of evidence collection that would be required for the investigation. The decision to immediately pursue Bear 291 was complicated by several factors that would create ongoing controversy in the aftermath of the attack. Standard protocol called for the destruction of any bear involved in a fatal attack on humans, but the animal's current location was unknown, the attack site remained unsecured, and Father O'Connor's remains needed to be recovered before they were completely consumed or scattered by scavengers. Additionally, approaching the area while the bear might still be in the vicinity posed significant risks to rescue personnel. Dr. Hayes provided initial medical assessments of the surviving congregation members while they awaited evacuation from the trailhead parking area. His examinations revealed numerous cases of acute stress reaction, several minor injuries sustained during the hasty evacuation, and Dorothy Kowalski's ongoing cardiac episode that required immediate medical attention. The physician's calm professionalism provided a stabilizing influence on the group, while internally he struggled with the knowledge that he would carry the memory of Father O'Connor's horrific death for the rest of his life. The media response to the attack began within hours of the initial emergency calls, as word of the tragedy spread through the interconnected networks of law enforcement, emergency services, and local news organizations. The first news report, broadcast by KTVQ in Billings at 2:45 p.m., provided only basic information about a serious wildlife incident in Yellowstone. But by evening, the story had attracted national attention due to the unique circumstances of a religious service being interrupted by a fatal predator attack. Maria Rodriguez found herself serving as an unofficial spokesperson for the surviving congregation members, her nursing background providing her with the communication skills and emotional stability needed to interact with increasingly persistent media representatives. Her primary concern remained the welfare of the children who had witnessed the attack, including her own daughter Emma, whose 1,000-yard stare and mechanical responses to questions indicated the onset of traumatic shock that would require professional intervention. The recovery of Father O'Connor's remains presented extraordinary challenges that extended far beyond the typical complexities of wilderness body recovery. Bear 291's continued presence in the area, confirmed by aerial surveillance conducted at 3:30 p.m., meant that ground-based recovery efforts would require armed escorts and pose significant risks to personnel. Additionally, the extent of the bear's feeding behavior raised difficult questions about what exactly could be recovered and how the remains should be handled in accordance with both legal requirements and the family's religious preferences. Yellowstone's Incident Command Structure activated its full emergency response protocol, bringing together representatives from multiple agencies, including the National Park Service, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Park County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI's Evidence Response Team. The complexity of coordinating between federal, state, and local jurisdictions while managing media attention and public safety concerns created logistical challenges that would test the preparedness plans that had been developed for such scenarios. Bishop Thomas McCarthy of the Diocese of Great Falls Billings received notification of Father O'Connor's death at 4:15 p.m. and immediately began the journey to Yellowstone to provide spiritual support to the surviving congregation members. His 40-minute drive from Billings to the park provided time to grapple with the theological questions that would inevitably arise from such a tragic event, particularly the challenge of explaining how a loving God could permit such suffering to befall one of his most devoted servants. The first detailed witness interviews were conducted by Park Service investigators beginning at 4:45 p.m., with particular attention paid to James Mitchell's account due to his expertise in wildlife behavior and his clear observations of the attack sequence. Mitchell's testimony would prove crucial in establishing the timeline of events and understanding the bear's behavioral patterns, though the hunting guide would struggle with survivors' guilt over his inability to prevent the priest's death despite his wilderness experience. Margaret Sullivan's interview, conducted with sensitivity to her age and emotional state, provided investigators with valuable details about the attack's immediate aftermath and the congregation's evacuation. Her 78 years of life experience had given her a resilience that many younger witnesses lacked, allowing her to provide clear, detailed testimony even while processing her own grief and trauma. Her account would become particularly important in understanding how the attack had affected different age groups within the congregation. The psychological trauma manifesting among the witnesses presented immediate challenges for emergency responders who were equipped to handle physical injuries but less prepared for the complex mental health needs of 84 individuals who had experienced severe psychological shock. Dr. Hayes, despite his own traumatic experience, volunteered to provide initial psychological first aid, while professional mental health counselors were summoned from Billings and Bozeman. Emma Rodriguez's condition particularly concerned the responding mental health professionals, as the 16-year-old had essentially stopped speaking after reaching the trailhead and showed signs of dissociative shock that could indicate the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder. Her mother Maria's nursing background helped her recognize the severity of her daughter's condition, but her own emotional state complicated her to provide the support that Emma desperately needed. The tactical team assembled to recover Father O'Connor's remains included specially trained park rangers, Montana Fish Wildlife and parks personnel, and a veterinarian qualified to assess Bear 291's condition and behavior. The team's approach to the attack site, initiated at 5:30 p.m., required careful coordination to minimize noise and movement that might provoke another encounter while still accomplishing the essential tasks of evidence collection and body recovery. Aerial surveillance conducted by Park Service helicopters had confirmed that Bear 291 remained in the immediate vicinity of the attack site. Though the animal's exact position within the forested area could not be determined due to canopy coverage, the bear's decision to remain near the kill site rather than retreating to a more secluded location suggested either territorial behavior or continued feeding activity, both of which indicated elevated aggression levels that would complicate any ground-based recovery efforts. The decision to use tranquilizer darts rather than immediately destroying Bear 291 created significant controversy among the response team, with arguments focusing on public safety versus wildlife conservation principles. Chief Ranger Hawthorne ultimately decided to attempt tranquilization first, recognizing that a successful capture would provide valuable research data, while a failed attempt could always be followed by lethal force if necessary for personnel safety. Dr. Chen's knowledge of Bear 291's specific characteristics proved invaluable in calculating the appropriate tranquilizer dosage for an animal of his size and estimated stress level. The wildlife biologist's emotional investment in her research subject created an internal conflict between her scientific objectivity and her recognition that the bear's behavioral changes had made him a clear threat to public safety that likely could not be successfully rehabilitated. The approach to the attack site revealed the full extent of the tragedy in ways that crime scene photographs and witness testimony could not fully convey. Father O'Connor's remains, scattered across an area approximately 20 feet in diameter, bore witness to the savage efficiency with which a grizzly bear can process a human body. The scene's impact on even experienced emergency responders would necessitate psychological debriefing for the entire recovery team. Bear 291's reaction to the approaching recovery team demonstrated the heightened aggression levels that had characterized his recent behavior. Rather than retreating when confronted by humans, as would be typical for most bears, he initially stood his ground and displayed aggressive posturing that included huffing vocalizations, lip-smacking, and the classic head-swaying behavior that precedes a charge. The bear's willingness to confront multiple humans rather than abandoning his kill site confirmed the behavioral changes that Dr. Chen had been documenting throughout the summer. The successful tranquilization of Bear 291, accomplished at 6:47 p.m., required 2 dart deployments due to the animal's size and agitated state. The first dart, delivered from a distance of approximately 40 yards, contained enough immobilization drugs to subdue most grizzlies, but only partially sedated this particular animal. The second dart, administered 15 minutes later after careful observation of the bear's response to the initial dose, finally achieved the level of sedation necessary for safe approach by recovery personnel. The examination of Father O'Connor's remains by the medical examiner would later confirm that death had occurred within minutes of the initial attack, providing some comfort to family members and congregation witnesses who had worried about the extent of the priest's suffering. The autopsy findings, while necessarily graphic due to the nature of the injuries, established that massive blood loss and traumatic shock had rendered the victim unconscious relatively quickly, limiting the duration of conscious pain and terror. The recovery of physical evidence from the attack site proved challenging due to the combination of the bear's feeding behavior and the natural environment's tendency to absorb and disperse biological materials. Forensic specialists collected samples of blood, tissue, and torn clothing, while photographers documented the scene from multiple angles to create a comprehensive record for the subsequent investigation and any potential legal proceedings. The transportation of Father O'Connor's remains to the medical examiner's office in Billings required special handling due to the traumatic nature of the injuries and the need to preserve evidence for the official investigation. The priest's family, notified earlier in the day, had requested that his remains be treated with the dignity appropriate to his position within the church, a request that complicated but did not prevent the thorough forensic examination required by law. Bear 291's unconscious form presented its own logistical challenges, as moving an 800-pound animal from a remote wilderness location required specialized equipment and trained personnel. The decision regarding the bear's ultimate fate remained pending, while wildlife officials, park administrators, and law enforcement personnel debated the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding an animal that had killed a human but had been displaying increasingly abnormal behavior that might indicate underlying medical or environmental factors. The evening news broadcasts on July 12th carried the story as their lead item, with reporters struggling to convey the unprecedented nature of an attack that had occurred during a religious service in front of numerous witnesses. The unique circumstances of the tragedy captured public attention in ways that typical wildlife encounters did not, generating discussions about wilderness safety, the appropriateness of large gatherings in predator habitat, and the theological questions raised by such a seemingly random act of violence. The congregation members who had witnessed the attack found themselves dealing with a complex mixture of grief, trauma, and media attention that would complicate their healing process for months to come. Many expressed feeling guilty about surviving when their beloved priest had not, while others struggled with anger toward God, the park service, or the circumstances that had brought them to that remote clearing on what should have been a day of spiritual celebration. Dr. Hayes spent the evening of July 12th providing medical consultation to mental health professionals who were developing treatment plans for the most severely affected witnesses. His unique perspective as both a medical professional and a direct witness to the attack provided valuable insights into the specific types of trauma that the survivors were experiencing, though he continued to struggle with his own emotional responses to the day's events. The initial investigation phase, conducted throughout the afternoon and evening of July 12th, established the basic facts of the attack while raising numerous questions that would require weeks or months to answer fully. The presence of so many witnesses created an unusual situation for investigators, as conflicting memories and perceptions needed to be reconciled into a coherent understanding of exactly what had occurred and why. Emergency shelters were established in Gardner, Montana, to provide temporary accommodation for congregation members who were unable or unwilling to immediately return to their homes in Billings. The psychological state of many witnesses made driving inadvisable, while others simply needed time to process their experiences before resuming normal activities. The logistical challenge of caring for 84 traumatized individuals tested the emergency response capabilities of the small Gateway community. The first family members of attack witnesses began arriving in the Yellowstone area during the evening hours, having made hurried trips from Billings and other Montana communities after receiving phone calls about the tragedy. The reunion scenes between families, while providing emotional support for the survivors, also created additional stress as loved ones struggled to understand and respond to the psychological trauma that their relatives had experienced. Maria Rodriguez found herself coordinating much of the family notification and reunion process due to her nursing background and her relative emotional stability compared to other congregation members. Her ability to communicate clearly with both emergency responders and arriving family members made her an invaluable liaison, though the responsibility added to her own stress while she worried about her daughter Emma's deteriorating psychological condition. The decision to euthanize Bear 291 was reached at 9:30 p.m. on July 12th, following consultations between park officials, wildlife biologists, and law enforcement personnel. The conclusion that the bear's behavioral changes made him an ongoing threat to public safety, combined with established protocols for dealing with predators involved in fatal attacks, left little room for alternative approaches, despite the arguments of some wildlife advocates for relocation or extended rehabilitation efforts. Dr. Chen's final examination of Bear 291 before his euthanization revealed several factors that may have contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior, including dental problems that would have made normal feeding difficult, parasitic infections that could have caused chronic discomfort, and nutritional deficiencies consistent with the drought conditions that had affected the region throughout the summer. While these findings provided some explanation for the bear's behavioral changes, they could not eliminate the threat he posed to future human encounters. The euthanization procedure, carried out by qualified veterinary personnel, was witnessed by a small group of officials who documented the process for legal and scientific purposes. The death of Bear 291 marked the end of his 6-year research history, while simultaneously eliminating the immediate threat he had posed to park visitors. His tissue samples would be preserved for ongoing research into the factors that can drive normally reclusive animals to view humans as prey rather than threats to be avoided. The overnight period following the attack saw little sleep among the survivor community as most witnesses experienced the nightmares, flashbacks, and hypervigilance symptoms that typically characterize acute stress reactions. The temporary shelter facilities established by emergency services provided physical comfort, but could do little to address the psychological wounds that would require professional treatment and extended time to heal. Emma Rodriguez's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the night, with her mother Maria becoming increasingly concerned about her daughter's complete withdrawal from verbal communication and her apparent inability to process simple instructions or questions. The teenager's symptom pattern suggested the onset of acute dissociative disorder, a condition that would require specialized psychiatric intervention to prevent long-term psychological damage. The investigation team working through the night to process evidence from the attack site discovered several items of particular interest, including Father O'Connor's torn and bloodied Bible, which had been scattered across the kill site during the bear's feeding behavior. The symbolic significance of the damaged religious text would become a focal point for theological discussions about the meaning and purpose of the tragedy, though investigators treated it simply as physical evidence to be preserved and documented. The second day of the investigation, July 13th, began with more detailed interviews of key witnesses as investigators attempted to create a minute-by-minute timeline of the attack sequence. The psychological state of many witnesses had stabilized somewhat overnight, allowing for more coherent testimony, though several individuals remained too traumatized to provide detailed accounts without triggering severe anxiety reactions. James Mitchell's second interview provided crucial details about Bear 291's pre-attack behavior that had not been apparent during the chaos of the previous day. His observations of the bear's stalking patterns, approach route, and initial aggressive displays would prove valuable in understanding whether the attack might have been prevented through different human responses or whether the outcome was essentially inevitable once the predator had focused on the congregation as potential prey. Margaret Sullivan's resilience continued to impress investigators and mental health professionals as she provided detailed, coherent testimony about her observations during the attack and evacuation. Her account included several details that other witnesses had missed or forgotten, including her observation that Father O'Connor had attempted to continue his sermon even after spotting the approaching bear, suggesting either incredible faith or a failure to fully comprehend the danger he faced. The autopsy of Father O'Connor, conducted on July 13th by Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Williams, confirmed the preliminary assessment that death had occurred rapidly following the initial attack. The examination revealed that the priest's injuries were consistent with those typically seen in large predator attacks, with massive trauma to vital organs and blood vessels that would have caused unconsciousness within minutes and death shortly thereafter. Dr. Williams' autopsy report, while necessarily clinical in its language and approach, provided important information for both the legal investigation and the emotional healing of the victim's family and congregation. The confirmation that Father O'Connor's suffering had been brief, while not eliminating the tragedy of his death, offered some comfort to those who had been tormented by images of extended agony during the bear's feeding behavior. The necropsy performed on Bear 291 revealed additional information about the factors that may have contributed to his aggressive behavior toward humans. The examination confirmed the presence of multiple health issues that would have caused chronic pain and difficulty in normal foraging behavior, potentially explaining his willingness to view humans as alternative food sources rather than threats to be avoided. The discovery of human tissue in Bear 291's stomach contents provided definitive proof of the predation behavior that witnesses had described, confirming that the attack had transitioned beyond defensive aggression to active feeding. This finding supported the decision to euthanize the animal, while also providing valuable research data about the circumstances that can lead normally human-avoidant predators to view people as prey. The media coverage of the attack intensified on July 13th as national news organizations picked up the story and began sending reporters to the Yellowstone area. The unique circumstances of the tragedy, a religious service interrupted by a fatal predator attack, generated intense public interest, while creating additional stress for survivors who found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight during their most vulnerable period. Bishop McCarthy's arrival in the area on July 13th provided crucial spiritual support for the surviving congregation members, many of whom were struggling with fundamental questions about their faith in the aftermath of witnessing such violence. His experience in providing pastoral care during tragedies helped him address the theological challenges raised by Father O'Connor's death, while respecting the individual ways that different parishioners were processing their grief and trauma. The bishop's first group meeting with survivors, held on the evening of July 13th, became an emotional catharsis for many congregation members who'd been holding their feelings inside since witnessing the attack. The gathering provided a safe space for expressing anger, grief, confusion, and guilt, while beginning the long process of integrating the traumatic experience into their ongoing faith journeys. Dr. Hayes continued to provide medical consultation throughout July 13th, though his own emotional state remained fragile as he processed the memory of watching his priest and friend die in such a horrific manner. His medical training helped him maintain professional objectivity when assisting other survivors, but privately, he struggled with questions about whether any medical intervention could have saved Father O'Connor's life if circumstances had been different. The psychological evaluation of the most severely traumatized witnesses, conducted by specialist teams from Billings and Bozeman, identified several individuals who would require intensive long-term treatment to recover from their experiences. Emma Rodriguez was among those flagged for immediate psychiatric intervention, as her continued withdrawal and dissociative symptoms indicated a high risk for developing chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. The investigation's third day, July 14th, focused on environmental and circumstantial factors that may have contributed to the attack, including weather conditions, wildlife movement patterns, and the specific location chosen for the outdoor worship service. This broader analysis aimed to determine whether the tragedy could have been prevented through different planning decisions or safety protocols. Dr. Chen's detailed analysis of Bear 291's recent movement patterns based on GPS collar data and field observations revealed that the animal had been ranging closer to human use areas throughout the summer of 2024. This behavioral shift, possibly driven by drought-related food scarcity, had brought him into proximity with hiking trails and gathering areas more frequently than in previous years, suggesting an increased risk for human-bear encounters that had not been fully recognized by park officials. The examination of park safety protocols revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the systems designed to prevent wildlife attacks during permitted activities. While the required safety briefings and equipment requirements were comprehensive on paper, the implementation and enforcement of these measures had varied considerably depending on the specific ranger or official processing the permits. The special use permit issued for the outdoor worship service was found to be technically compliant with existing regulations, though several investigators noted that the permit review process did not adequately account for recent changes in local bear behavior or the increased wildlife activity associated with drought conditions. This finding would lead to recommendations for enhanced permit review procedures that incorporated real-time wildlife monitoring data. The congregation's gradual exodus from the Yellowstone area began on July 14th as families made difficult decisions about their readiness to return home and resume normal activities. For many, the prospect of returning to familiar surroundings offered the promise of psychological healing, while others worried that leaving the area might somehow constitute abandoning Father O'Connor or failing to fully honor his memory. Maria Rodriguez made the decision to remain in the area for several additional days due to her concerns about Emma's psychological condition and her reluctance to make major changes while her daughter remained in such a fragile state. The extended stay would prove beneficial for Emma's treatment, as it allowed for continuity of care with the mental health professionals who had begun working with her immediately after the attack. The first news interviews with attack survivors conducted on July 14th provided the public with first-hand accounts of the tragedy while highlighting the ongoing psychological trauma that many witnesses continued to experience. James Mitchell's interview with a national news network became particularly noteworthy for his detailed description of the attack sequence and his professional assessment of the factors that had contributed to the tragedy. Margaret Sullivan's interview focused primarily on Father O'Connor's character and ministry, providing viewers with a more complete picture of the man who had died, rather than focusing exclusively on the manner of his death. Her ability to speak coherently about both the tragedy and its broader meaning demonstrated the resilience that had allowed her to survive nearly 8 decades of life's challenges. The theological discussions that began emerging in religious communities across the country reflected the challenge that Father O'Connor's death posed for traditional concepts of divine protection and the purpose of suffering. Seminary professors, religious scholars, and practicing clergy found themselves grappling with questions about how such a devoted servant of God could meet such a violent end while engaged in worship and ministry. The investigation's findings, released in preliminary form on July 15th, concluded that the attack was the result of an unfortunate combination of environmental factors, animal behavioral changes, and human activities, rather than any single preventable cause. This conclusion, while scientifically accurate, provided little comfort to survivors who continued to search for meaning and purpose in their traumatic experience. The recommendation for enhanced wildlife monitoring and permit review procedures represented one of the investigation's few actionable outcomes, though implementing these changes would require coordination between multiple agencies and significant increases in funding for wildlife research and management programs. The bureaucratic and financial challenges associated with these recommendations raised questions about whether similar tragedies could realistically be prevented in the future. Father O'Connor's funeral, held in Billings on July 18th, drew over 1,000 mourners, including many individuals who had never met the priest but had been moved by the circumstances of his death. The service, celebrated by Bishop McCarthy with assistance from clergy throughout the region, focused on the priest's 40-year ministry rather than the manner of his death, though the tragedy's impact was evident in the heightened security measures and media presence surrounding the event. The homily delivered by Bishop McCarthy addressed directly the theological questions raised by Father O'Connor's death, acknowledging the challenge that such violence posed for faith, while arguing that the priest's dedication to serving others, demonstrated even in his final moments, represented a form of martyrdom that gave meaning to his suffering. The bishop's words provided comfort to some mourners, while leaving others to continue wrestling with their doubts and anger. The presence of surviving congregation members at the funeral created powerful emotional moments as individuals who had shared the traumatic experience found themselves reliving aspects of the attack through their memories and grief. Several survivors required medical attention during the service due to anxiety attacks and other stress-related symptoms triggered by the intense emotional environment. Emma Rodriguez's continued absence from normal activities, including her failure to attend Father O'Connor's funeral, reflected the severity of her ongoing psychological trauma and the extended treatment process that would be required for her recovery. Her mother, Maria's decision to prioritize her daughter's mental health over social expectations, demonstrated the difficult choices that many families affected by the tragedy would face during their healing processes. The media coverage of Father O'Connor's funeral marked a transition in the public narrative surrounding the attack, with greater emphasis placed on celebrating the priest's life and ministry rather than focusing exclusively on the violent circumstances of his death. This shift reflected both the natural progression of news cycles and the deliberate efforts of church officials and family members to control the story's direction. The one-week anniversary of the attack, July 19th, brought renewed media attention and prompted many survivors to reflect publicly on their healing progress and ongoing challenges. The variety of responses demonstrated that recovery from such trauma follows no predictable timeline, with some individuals showing remarkable resilience while others continued to struggle with basic daily activities. Dr. Hayes published a medical journal article about the attack that focused on the unique challenges of providing emergency medical care in wilderness settings, where dangerous wildlife may still pose ongoing threats to rescue personnel. His clinical analysis of the incident provided valuable insights for emergency medical professionals, while carefully avoiding sensationalized descriptions of the violence he had witnessed. The article's discussion of the psychological trauma experienced by medical professionals who witnessed such events highlighted an often overlooked aspect of wilderness emergencies, as trained medical personnel struggled to balance their professional obligations with their own emotional needs in situations where their skills were rendered useless by the extent of the trauma or the ongoing danger. James Mitchell's detailed report to wildlife management agencies provided crucial data about predator behavior that would inform future safety protocols and educational programs. His professional assessment of the factors that had contributed to the attack offered practical insights that could potentially prevent similar tragedies, though he remained haunted by questions about whether different actions on his part might have saved Father O'Connor's life. The hunting guide's struggle with survivor's guilt reflected a common theme among the congregation members, as many individuals questioned whether they could have done something differently to prevent or interrupt the attack. Mental health professionals working with the survivors consistently reinforced that the attack's speed and the bear's focused aggression left virtually no opportunity for effective intervention by untrained civilians. The establishment of the Father Michael O'Connor Memorial Fund on July 20th provided a constructive outlet for the community's grief while ensuring that the priest's memory would be honored through ongoing charitable work. The fund's focus on wilderness safety education and youth ministry reflected Father O'Connor's own interests and provided a positive legacy emerging from the tragedy. The Memorial Fund's rapid growth, reaching over $50,000 within its first week, demonstrated the broad impact that Father O'Connor's death had made on communities far beyond his immediate parish. Donations came from individuals who had never met the priest, but had been moved by the circumstances of his death and wanted to contribute to preventing similar tragedies. The 2-week mark following the attack brought the first serious discussions about when and how the surviving congregation members might feel comfortable participating in group worship activities again. The psychological trauma associated with their shared experience had created barriers to traditional religious practices that would require careful consideration and professional guidance to overcome. Bishop McCarthy's consultations with trauma specialists resulted in recommendations for a gradual return to group worship, beginning with small gatherings in secure indoor settings and eventually progressing to larger services as individual comfort levels permitted. The process would need to be individualized, as different survivors showed vastly different levels of readiness to resume religious activities that reminded them of the attack. Emma Rodriguez's first significant breakthrough in treatment occurred on July 26th, 2 weeks after the attack, when she finally began speaking again during a therapy session. Her initial words, according to her therapist's notes, focused on her guilt about surviving when Father O'Connor had not, a common theme among survivors that would require extensive processing through continued therapy. The teenager's recovery would prove to be gradual and non-linear, with periods of apparent progress followed by setbacks triggered by unexpected reminders of the traumatic experience. Her case would become a model for treating adolescent trauma survivors as mental health professionals learn to navigate the unique challenges posed by developing minds attempting to process extreme violence. The 1-month anniversary of the attack prompted a private memorial service for the surviving congregation members, held in the familiar surroundings of St. Catherine's Parish in Billings. The gathering provided an opportunity for shared grieving and mutual support, while avoiding the media attention and public scrutiny that had complicated earlier memorial events. The private service revealed how differently individual survivors were processing their experiences, with some finding comfort in traditional religious rituals, while others struggled with faith-related questions that made conventional worship difficult or impossible. The variety of responses reinforced the need for individualized approaches to healing, rather than assuming uniform effects from the shared traumatic experience. Margaret Sullivan's decision to share her story publicly, beginning with a local newspaper interview in early August, provided a thoughtful perspective on aging, faith, and resilience in the face of unexpected tragedy. Her words offered wisdom gained through decades of life experience, while acknowledging the unique challenges posed by witnessing such extreme violence at an advanced age. The elderly woman's reflection on how the attack had affected her relationship with nature and wilderness areas resonated with many readers who had struggled with similar feelings after learning about the tragedy. Her eventual decision to return to outdoor activities while taking additional safety precautions became an inspiration for others who had developed fears about wilderness recreation. Dr. Chen's comprehensive research report on Bear 291, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in September 2024, provided the scientific community with detailed insights into the factors that can drive normally human-avoidant predators to view people as potential prey. Her analysis would influence bear management practices throughout North America, while serving as a memorial to both Father O'Connor and the bear whose behavioral changes had led to the tragedy. The research findings confirmed that multiple environmental and physiological stresses had combined to alter Bear 291's behavior in ways that significantly increased the risk of human-wildlife conflict. The drought conditions, habitat degradation, increased human activity in traditional bear territories, and the animal's declining health had created a perfect storm of factors that made some form of serious incident increasingly likely. The 6-month anniversary of the attack in January 2025 marked a significant milestone in the recovery process for many survivors, though several individuals continued to require ongoing psychological support. The winter months had provided a natural respite from outdoor activities that might trigger traumatic memories, but the approaching spring raised concerns about how survivors would respond to returning to wilderness environments. Emma Rodriguez's continued progress in therapy had allowed her to return to school and resume many normal activities, though she remained in treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and continued to experience occasional flashbacks and nightmares. Her case had become a learning opportunity for mental health professionals working with adolescent trauma survivors, contributing to improved treatment protocols for similar cases. The legal proceedings related to the attack, while limited due to the natural cause of the tragedy, included several civil lawsuits filed against the National Park Service by families seeking compensation for their psychological trauma. These cases raised complex questions about governmental liability for wildlife attacks in natural settings and the extent to which park authorities could be held responsible for the behavior of wild animals. The lawsuit's outcomes would establish important precedents for future cases involving wildlife attacks in national parks, though the legal proceedings added additional stress to survivors who were still working through their emotional recovery. The adversarial nature of the legal system proved particularly challenging for individuals who were already struggling with trauma-related trust issues and anxiety disorders. The first anniversary of Father O'Connor's death, July 12, 2025, brought together many of the surviving congregation members for a memorial service that focused on celebrating the priest's life and ministry rather than dwelling on the circumstances of his death. The gathering demonstrated how far many survivors had progressed in their healing, while acknowledging that some individuals would carry the psychological scars of their experience for the rest of their lives. The anniversary also marked the completion of a comprehensive study of the attack and its aftermath, conducted by researchers from Montana State University in collaboration with the National Park Service. The study's findings would inform future wilderness safety protocols while providing valuable insights into the factors that contribute to successful psychological recovery from mass trauma events. The long-term impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate survivors, influencing wildlife management practices, emergency response protocols, and public perceptions of wilderness recreation throughout North America. Father O'Connor's death had sparked important conversations about the balance between conservation and public safety, while highlighting the need for better understanding of the factors that can lead to dangerous wildlife behavior. The surviving congregation members continued to demonstrate remarkable resilience as they rebuilt their lives and faith in the years following the tragedy. Their experiences contributed to improved support systems for trauma survivors, while their ongoing recovery served as inspiration for others facing their own challenges. Father Michael O'Connor's legacy lived on not only through their survival and healing, but through the positive changes that emerged from one of the most horrific wildlife attacks in Yellowstone National Park's history.